Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss any new content.
I found Sarah Garrett's boots first. They were sitting side by side on a granite outcropping 3 miles into Thornwood National Forest, laces still tied, soles caked with mud that had dried days ago in the summer heat. Her socks were folded neatly inside them. The rest of her was gone. That was 6 weeks ago, and I have not slept properly since. My name is Daniel Moss, and I have been a ranger at Thornwood for 11 years. I thought I knew these woods. I thought I understood the rhythms of this place, the way morning fog rolls through the valleys, the patterns of deer migration, the places where black bears den in winter. I was wrong. There is something else here, something that has always been here, and it has started to move. The morning Sarah disappeared began like any other morning in late June. I was at the Ridgeline station alone, brewing coffee in the small kitchen while the radio crackled with static and the occasional check-in from rangers farther south. Sarah had signed out the previous afternoon for a solo photography hike along the Widows Creek Trail, a moderate 6-mile loop that wound through old-growth forest before circling back to the main road. She was an experienced hiker, 28 years old, a freelance nature photographer who had worked in parks across the West. She knew what she was doing. When she did not return by nightfall, I was not immediately concerned. Hikers sometimes misjudge distances or stop to capture the perfect shot as the light changes. But when her car was still parked at the trailhead the next morning, I called it in and organized a search. We found her camera first, a professional Nikon with a telephoto lens, lying in the middle of the trail 2 miles in. The lens was shattered. The camera body was intact, but the memory card was missing. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no torn fabric caught on branches. Just the camera lying there in the dirt as if she had simply set it down and walked away. The prints around it were strange. Her boot treads were clear enough heading north along the trail, but then they stopped abruptly beside a massive rotting hemlock. After that point, there was nothing. The forest floor was soft with decomposing needles, and it should have held impressions, but there was only smooth, undisturbed ground, as if she had simply ceased to exist at that exact spot. We searched in expanding circles. We brought in dogs. They picked up her scent easily enough, following it to the same hemlock where her prints ended, and then the dogs did something I had never seen in 15 years of search and rescue work. They stopped. All 3 of them sat down simultaneously, whining, and refused to go any farther. Their handler, a woman named Marie Chen, who had worked with those dogs for a decade, looked at me with confusion that bordered on fear. She tried to coax them forward. They would not move. One of them, a German shepherd named Duke who had found 12 missing persons over his career, began to shake. We continued without the dogs. The search went on for 5 days. We covered 40 square miles of forest. State police brought in helicopters with thermal imaging. Volunteers from 3 counties showed up to walk grid patterns through the underbrush. We found nothing except her boots on that outcropping on day 4 and a single white button from her shirt caught in a blackberry thicket half a mile from where her camera had been. The button was torn, ripped away with force. That was all. On the 6th day, the official search was called off. Sarah Garrett was listed as missing, presumed dead, and her parents came from Ohio to collect her belongings. I watched her mother fold Sarah's clothes in the small cabin she had rented in town, and I wanted to tell her something that would help, but I had nothing. The forest had swallowed her daughter and left almost no trace. That night I returned to the Ridgeline station and sat on the porch watching darkness fill the valley below. The forest was quiet. Too quiet. It was summer, and there should have been the constant buzz of insects, the calls of owls beginning their nightly hunts, the rustle of small creatures moving through the underbrush. Instead, there was only silence, deep and complete, as if the woods themselves were holding their breath. I have worked in remote places for most of my adult life, and I have learned to read the moods of wild country. That night, the forest felt wrong. It felt watched. I went inside and locked the door, something I had never done before in all my years at Thornwood. Sarah was not the first. I did not know it then, but over the following weeks I would dig through old files in the basement of the main ranger station, and I would find a pattern stretching back decades. The records were incomplete, scattered across different filing systems and archived in boxes that smelled of mildew and time. But the pattern was there if you knew what to look for. In 1978, a geology student named Michael Brennan vanished while studying rock formations in the northern section of the park. His tent was found intact, his sleeping bag still warm, his boots lined up outside the entrance. He was never seen again. In 1985, two deer hunters, brothers named Frank and Lou Messina, failed to return from a trip into the backcountry. Their truck was found at a Forest Service road 5 miles from the trailhead. The doors were open, the engine was running, their rifles were still in the gun rack. A search team found Frank's body 3 weeks later in a ravine 8 miles from where the truck had been abandoned. The coroner ruled it death by exposure but noted extensive bruising across his torso and legs consistent with a fall from a great height. Lou was never found. In 1993, a ranger named Thomas Webb radioed in that he was investigating unusual activity near the old Mackenzie fire tower. His last transmission was cut off mid-sentence. When backup arrived 6 hours later, they found his truck parked at the base of the tower, but Thomas was gone. His radio was on the driver's seat, still turned on. His pack was in the back. His service weapon was missing from its holster. They found the gun 2 days later in a stream bed 4 miles away. It had been fired 3 times. They never found Thomas. There were others. A botanist in 1998, a family of 4 in 2003, whose campsite was found abandoned with dinner still cooking on their camp stove. A trail maintenance worker in 2011 who vanished between 2 sections of trail less than a mile apart. 17 people over the course of 40 years, all of them experienced outdoorsmen and women, all of them familiar with wilderness survival, all of them gone without adequate explanation. The official explanation for most of these cases was accidental death due to falls, exposure, animal attacks, or disorientation, but the details never quite added up. There were too many abandoned belongings, too many signs of sudden flight, too many dogs that refused to track. Too many searches that ended in confusion and frustration. I began to wonder if someone in the Park Service had noticed the pattern years ago and simply decided it was better not to connect the dots. It was easier to treat each incident as isolated rather than admit that something was systematically taking people from these woods. After Sarah disappeared, I started paying attention to things I had previously dismissed. The reports that came in from hikers about strange sounds in the forest, the feeling of being followed on empty trails, the way certain areas of the park seemed to empty of wildlife at specific times of year. I began keeping my own records, noting anything unusual that crossed my desk or came in over the radio. What I found disturbed me. There were dozens of reports every year of people experiencing what they described as an overwhelming sense of dread while hiking certain trails. The locations were consistent. The Widow's Creek Trail where Sarah had vanished, the northern approach to Mackenzie Tower where Thomas Webb had disappeared, a stretch of old fire road called Deadfall Curve, the abandoned Fletcher Ranger Station in the remote northwest corner of the park. People reported feeling watched. They reported hearing heavy footsteps keeping pace with them through the trees. They reported a smell like rotting meat and wet earth. Most concerning were the reports of knocking sounds, deep wooden knocks that echoed through the forest at dusk. Dozens of hikers had reported hearing them over the years. The knocks always came in patterns of 3, separated by long silences, and they seemed to move through the trees as if whatever made them was circling, searching. I had heard the knocks myself over the years, but I had always assumed they were trees falling or branches striking together in the wind. Now I was not so sure. I began hiking the trails alone after my shifts ended, going to the places where people had vanished or reported strange encounters. I told myself I was looking for evidence, for some rational explanation that would make sense of Sarah's disappearance and all the others. But the truth was darker than that. I was looking for it, whatever it was. I wanted to see it with my own eyes. I wanted proof that I was not losing my mind. The forest in summer should be alive with sound and movement, but as I walked those trails in the long evening light, I found only silence and stillness. The birds seemed to avoid certain areas entirely. The normal debris of the forest floor, fallen branches and scattered pine cones and animal scat was absent in places, as if even the small processes of decay had been interrupted. The trees themselves looked wrong in those spots. Their bark was scored with deep parallel gouges running vertically up the trunks, marks that looked like they had been made by something massive dragging its claws along the wood as it passed. The gouges were too high to be from any bear. They were 8, 9, 10 feet up the trunks, strips of bark peeled away to reveal pale wood underneath. I measured them carefully. The spacing between the marks suggested something with a handspan of nearly 12 inches. I took photographs. I sent samples of the bark to a wildlife biologist I knew at the state university. She called me back 3 days later, and her voice had an edge to it I had never heard before. She said the marks were definitely made by claws, but the depth and length of the scoring suggested an animal far larger than any native species. She said the force required to gouge wood that deeply would be immense. She asked me if we had received any reports of escaped exotic animals in the area. I told her no. She was quiet for a long time, and then she said she could not explain the marks and suggested I contact a forensic specialist if I was seriously concerned. I did not call anyone else. I knew what they would say, that I was seeing patterns where none existed, that the marks could be from any number of sources, that the disappearances were tragic but explainable, that the woods were just woods and I was letting stress and grief cloud my judgment. But I knew what I had seen. More than that, I knew what I had felt, because by then I had felt it too, that sensation of being watched that so many hikers had reported. I felt it strongest near the Fletcher Station, the old ranger outpost that had been abandoned in the early 90s after budget cuts forced the park to consolidate operations. The station sat in a small clearing surrounded by old-growth forest 8 miles from the nearest maintained trail. The building was falling apart, its roof sagging, its windows broken, its porch rotting into the ground. Moss covered the northern wall and young trees grew up through gaps in the foundation. I had been there a few times over the years to check on the structure, and I had always found it merely sad, a monument to shrinking budgets and changing priorities. But when I hiked out there in mid-July, 3 weeks after Sarah vanished, I found something else. The feeling hit me half a mile before I reached the clearing. A pressure against my chest, a tightness in my throat, a sudden conviction that I should turn around and leave immediately. I forced myself forward. The trail was overgrown but still passable, and the afternoon sun filtered down through the canopy in dusty shafts of light. Everything looked normal. Everything felt wrong. The forest was absolutely silent. When I emerged into the clearing and saw the Fletcher Station, I stopped. The door was open. I had been here 9 months ago in October, and I had checked that door personally. It had been locked, the padlock secure. Now it hung open, swaying slightly in a breeze I could not feel. I approached slowly. The porch boards creaked under my weight. I called out but received no answer. The interior was dark and smelled of mold and rot and something else, something organic and foul, like spoiled meat. I turned on my flashlight and stepped inside. The main room was empty except for an old desk and filing cabinet. Leaves and debris covered the floor. Animal droppings suggested mice and possibly raccoons had taken up residence. But there was something else. In the center of the floor, someone had arranged objects in a careful circle. I moved closer and felt my stomach turn. The objects were bones, small bones, bird and rodent from the size of them, cleaned completely of flesh and laid out in a precise pattern. At the center of the circle was a small pile of items that did not belong. A silver bracelet, a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, a military dog tag, a child's plastic hair clip, a wedding ring. I recognized the bracelet immediately. Sarah had worn it every day. I had seen it on her wrist when she signed out for her hike. I stood there for a long time staring at those objects while something cold moved through my chest. This was not the work of an animal. Animals do not collect human belongings and arrange them in careful patterns. Animals do not create shrines. I took photographs. I bagged the items as evidence. I searched the rest of the building and found nothing else except more of those deep claw marks on the inside walls, gouges that ran from floor to ceiling in long parallel lines. When I stepped back outside, the sun had moved and shadows had filled the clearing. The forest around me was still utterly silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. I began walking back toward the trail, and I had made it perhaps 20 yards when I heard it. 3 deep knocks from somewhere in the forest to my left. The sound was like wood striking wood, but amplified, resonant, carrying across the distance with unnatural clarity. I stopped and turned toward the sound. The knocks came again, the same pattern of 3, but farther away now, deeper in the trees. I waited. Silence returned and stretched out for perhaps 2 minutes. Then the knocks came again from a different direction, behind me and to the right. Whatever was making that sound was circling me. I started walking again, moving quickly now, not quite running, but close. The trail seemed longer than I remembered. The trees pressed in close on either side, and the light was fading faster than it should have been. I kept my hand on the radio at my belt, but I did not call in. What would I say? That I was scared. That something was following me through the woods. That I had found a collection of human belongings arranged by something that should not exist. They would think I was cracking up. Maybe I was. The knocks followed me all the way back to the main trail. They stayed in the trees, always just out of sight, maintaining the same distance. 3 knocks. Long silence. 3 more knocks from a new position. It was hurting me. I realized that with sudden cold clarity, it was keeping me moving in a specific direction, pushing me along like a shepherd moves sheep. When I finally reached my truck where I had parked it on the Forest Service road, I was breathing hard and my hands were shaking. I got in and locked the doors and sat there for a moment, forcing myself to calm down. The knocking had stopped. The forest around me looked normal in the late afternoon light. I started the engine and drove back to the Ridgeline station, and I did not stop until I was inside with the doors locked and the lights on. That night I filed a report about the items I had found at the Fletcher station. I submitted the photographs and evidence bags to the regional office. I requested that Sarah's case be reopened and that someone from the main office come to conduct a thorough investigation of the area. I did not mention the knocking sounds or the feeling of being followed. I kept my language clinical and professional. 2 days later, I received a call from my supervisor, a man named Gerald Hutchins, who worked out of the state capitol and rarely visited the actual parks he oversaw. He thanked me for the report. He said the items would be examined and that he appreciated my diligence. Then he suggested gently that I might be working too hard, that Sarah's disappearance had clearly affected me, that perhaps I should consider taking some time off. I told him I was fine. He said he would send someone to collect the evidence, but that I should focus on my regular duties and leave the investigation to the proper authorities. The conversation left me feeling hollow. I understood what he was really saying. Stop digging. Stop asking questions. Accept that these things happen in wild places and move on. But I could not move on. Because 3 nights after I found those items at the Fletcher station, I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of something massive moving through the forest around the Ridgeline station. I woke from a dreamless sleep to complete darkness and perfect silence. For a moment I lay still, unsure what had woken me. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy footsteps moving through the trees outside. Not the 4-footed gait of a deer or bear, but something that walked on 2 legs. Something big. The footfalls were slow and deliberate, and they circled the station at a distance of perhaps 30 yards. I could hear branches snapping under its weight. I could hear the undergrowth rustling as it passed. I got out of bed slowly and moved to the window. The forest outside was dark. My eyes had not adjusted and I could see almost nothing. I stood there in the darkness listening as whatever it was completed its circuit of the building and then moved away, crashing through the underbrush as it descended into the valley. The sounds faded. Silence returned. I spent the rest of that night sitting in the main room with all the lights on and my service pistol on the table in front of me. I felt ridiculous, but I could not shake the fear. Something had been out there, something large enough to make the ground shake with each step. Something that had come right up to the station and circled it as if checking, as if making sure I was inside. When dawn came, I went outside to look for tracks. I found them easily. They were not animal prints. They were not human prints. They were something in between, broad and elongated with what looked like 5 distinct toe impressions and the suggestion of a heel. Each print was roughly 18 inches long and pressed deep into the soft earth. The stride length was enormous, nearly 6 feet between each impression. I measured everything carefully. I took photographs. I tried to tell myself there was a logical explanation, a person in costume, a hoax, but the depth of the prints suggested something far heavier than any human. I followed the trail of prints down into the valley. They led through dense forest where the undergrowth was thick with ferns and fallen logs. Whatever had made these prints had simply walked through obstacles that should have forced it to go around. Small trees were pushed aside or broken. A rotting log 3 feet in diameter had a massive footprint pressed into its surface where the thing had simply stepped on it and kept going. I followed the trail for over a mile until it reached a stream and vanished into the water. I could not find where it emerged on the other side. I stood there at the edge of that stream and felt the forest pressing in around me. The air was thick and humid. Mist hung in the low places. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. I had the overpowering sense that I was being observed from somewhere just out of sight, that eyes were on me from the shadows beneath the trees. I turned and walked back to the station, and I did not look behind me, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. That afternoon, I drove into town and went to the public library. If the Park Service was not going to take this seriously, then I would find my own answers. I spent hours going through local newspaper archives searching for any references to strange occurrences in Thornwood. What I found was a history of unease stretching back to before the land was designated as a national forest. The earliest accounts came from the journals of settlers in the 1880s. A farmer named Josiah Fletcher, for whom the abandoned ranger station was presumably named, had written extensive accounts of something he called the walker that moved through the old-growth forests at night. His entries were detailed and consistent. He described a creature that stood upright like a man, but was far larger, covered in dark hair, with eyes that reflected firelight like an animal. He claimed it killed his livestock and left massive footprints around his property. He said it watched his family from the edge of the forest and that its presence filled him with a terror unlike anything he had experienced in the war. The local sheriff at the time dismissed Fletcher as a drunk and a storyteller, but other settlers made similar reports. In 1889, a logging crew working in what was now the northern section of the park abandoned their camp after several workers claimed to have seen a huge figure moving through the trees at dawn. In 1903, a group of railroad surveyors working through the area reported finding a crude shelter built from broken trees and filled with animal bones. In 1912, a young man hunting deer vanished in the forest and was found 3 days later clinging to life in a hollow tree. He claimed something had chased him through the woods for hours. He died the next day from exposure, and his final words, according to the doctor who treated him, were warnings never to enter those woods alone. The stories continued through the decades. As the area became state forest and then federal land, as tourism increased and the Park Service established itself, the reports did not stop. They just became more official, more sanitized, logged as missing persons cases and unexplained disappearances, filed away and forgotten. But the pattern remained. Every few years, someone vanished. Every few years, there were reports of something in the forest that should not be there. I made copies of everything I could find. I drove back to the station with a box of documents and a growing sense that I was in over my head. The sensible thing to do would be to request a transfer, to leave Thornwood and let someone else deal with whatever was happening here. But I kept thinking about Sarah, about her boots sitting on that rock, about her bracelet in that circle of bones. Someone needed to care about what happened to her. Someone needed to ask the hard questions, even if the answers were impossible. I spent the next week conducting what I told myself was a survey of park conditions, but was really a search for evidence of the creature. I hiked every major trail. I checked on the remote areas where hikers rarely ventured. I visited the sites where people had vanished over the years. What I found was consistent and disturbing. The trees bore those deep claw marks in multiple locations. The forest floor in certain areas was compressed and worn as if from regular heavy traffic along specific routes. I found more collections of bones and debris, always in remote places, always arranged with deliberate care. Near the old Mackenzie fire tower, I found a tree that had been partially stripped of its bark. The exposed wood underneath scored with what looked like territorial markings, deep gouges arranged in patterns that suggested intelligence and purpose. I set up trail cameras at several locations. Cameras were cheap now and effective in low light. If something was moving through these woods, I wanted footage. I positioned them carefully along game trails and near water sources and at the edges of clearings. I checked them every few days. Most of the footage was exactly what I expected. Deer moving through at dusk. Raccoons investigating the camera at night. Once a black bear ambling past in the early morning, but one camera, the one I had placed near a spring about 3 miles from the Fletcher station, captured something else. The footage was from 2 a.m. on a moonless night. The infrared gave everything a ghostly gray-green cast. For the first few seconds of the clip there was nothing, just the spring and the trees beyond it rendered in shades of gray. Then movement at the edge of the frame. Something enormous emerged from behind a tree. It moved into view slowly, cautiously, as if aware of the camera. For 3 seconds it stood there and I could see it clearly. It was massive, perhaps 9 feet tall, with a broad, hunched posture and long arms that reached nearly to its knees. Its body was covered in dark, matted hair. The face was partly visible in profile, more ape than human but not quite either, with a pronounced brow ridge and a large jaw. Then it turned and looked directly at the camera and I felt my breath catch. The eyes reflected the infrared in bright white circles. There was intelligence there. Awareness. It knew what the camera was. It stared for perhaps 2 seconds, and then it moved out of frame with shocking speed and the video ended. I watched that clip 50 times. I analyzed every frame. There was no possibility of fakery. This was not a person in a suit. The proportions were wrong. The movement was wrong. The sheer size of it was beyond anything human. I had captured proof. Proof that something massive and intelligent lived in these woods. Proof that might explain what had happened to Sarah and all the others. I should have taken that footage straight to the authorities. I should have called in wildlife experts and demanded a full investigation. Instead, I sat in my small office at the Ridgeline station and stared at that paused frame, at those intelligent eyes looking back at me, and I felt a deep primal fear that went beyond anything I had experienced before. This was not an animal. This was something else. Something that had been here long before the Park Service, long before the settlers, long before any human claim to these mountains. Something that considered this territory its own, and I had been documenting it, tracking it, invading its space with my cameras and my curiosity. I had made myself a target. That night, the knocking returned. It started just after dark, 3 deep, resonant knocks from somewhere in the valley below the station. Then silence. Then 3 more knocks from a different location. Closer now. I turned off all the lights and watched from the window as the sounds moved through the forest, circling, drawing nearer with each repetition. Whatever was out there was announcing itself, warning me, or perhaps calling to others of its kind. The knocks continued for nearly an hour before they finally stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I did not sleep. I sat in the darkness with my pistol in my lap and waited for dawn. When morning finally came, I made a decision. I would hike to the Fletcher station one more time. I would bring enough supplies to stay there for several days if needed. I would set up cameras covering all approaches, and I would wait. If this creature was territorial, if it was drawn to that location, then perhaps I could capture more footage. Perhaps I could find proof that even the Park Service could not ignore. Perhaps I could force them to take action. It was a stupid plan born of sleep deprivation and fear and stubbornness, but it was the only plan I had. I loaded my pack with food, water, extra batteries, and 4 additional trail cameras. I informed the regional office via email that I would be conducting a multi-day survey of the Northwest Quadrant. I told no one the real reason I was going. I set out early on a Wednesday morning in late July. The weather was clear and hot, and the forest was as silent as ever. I made good time on the maintained trails, but once I turned off onto the overgrown path that led to the Fletcher station, my pace slowed. Every shadow seemed to hold potential threat. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me tense. I stopped frequently to listen, but heard nothing unusual. I reached the clearing by early afternoon. The station looked exactly as I had left it weeks ago. The door still hung open. The porch still sagged under its own weight. I moved carefully, scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. Nothing. I entered the building and was hit by the smell, stronger now in the summer heat. That organic rot smell that made my eyes water. The circle of bones was still in the center of the main room, but it had been added to. There were more items now. A leather wallet, a child's shoe, a hunting knife, a torn piece of flannel shirt. None of these things had been here before. Something was still coming here, still adding to its collection. I set up my sleeping area in one of the back rooms where I would have walls on 3 sides and a view of both the main entrance and a window facing the clearing. I placed cameras at the 4 cardinal points around the station, positioning them to cover all approaches. I settled in to wait. The first day passed without incident. I sat in that musty room watching the light change as afternoon became evening, became night. I ate cold food from cans and drank water and listened to the absolute silence of the forest. No birds, no insects, the kind of quiet that feels like pressure against your eardrums. Night brought darkness so complete I could not see my hand in front of my face without my flashlight. I sat with my back against the wall and tried to stay alert. Sometime around midnight, I heard the footsteps. They were distant at first, moving through the forest with that same heavy, deliberate rhythm I had heard outside the Ridgeline station. I listened as they drew closer. They circled the clearing once, staying just inside the tree line where I could not see. Then they stopped. Silence for perhaps 10 minutes. Then 3 knocks, so loud and close they made me flinch. They came from directly behind the station. I waited. Nothing. I finally allowed myself to breathe again, and that was when I heard it move onto the porch. The boards creaked under enormous weight. I heard something scrape against the doorframe. I heard breathing, deep and slow, just outside the doorway to the main room. I sat frozen with my pistol in my hand and my flashlight off, and my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. Whatever was out there stayed for what felt like hours, but was probably only a few minutes. I could hear it shifting its weight. I could hear it testing the floorboards. Then it moved back outside, and the footsteps retreated into the forest and were gone. I did not move until dawn. When gray light finally began to filter through the dirty windows, I stood on shaking legs and made my way to the main room. The door was open wider than before. In the dust on the floor were massive handprints, 4 clear impressions where something had braced itself while looking inside. Each print showed 5 fingers, elongated and tipped with what looked like claw marks. I checked the cameras with trembling hands. 3 of the 4 had been destroyed, knocked from their positions and smashed against trees. The 4th had captured several frames of movement, but nothing clear, just blurred images of something massive moving past in the darkness. I packed my gear and left the Fletcher station within an hour. I did not run, but I walked fast, constantly checking behind me. The forest remained silent. Nothing followed me that I could see, but I could feel it out there, watching, making sure I left. When I reached my truck, I threw my pack in the back and drove away, and I did not stop until I was back at the Ridgeline station with the doors locked and the lights on. I stayed inside for 2 days. I called in sick, the first time I had taken a sick day in 5 years. I told myself I was processing what I had experienced. The truth was, I was terrified. I had seen evidence now that could not be explained away. I had been within yards of something that should not exist according to everything I had been taught about wildlife and nature. I had felt its presence, heard its breathing, seen the marks it left behind, and I understood with cold clarity that it had allowed me to leave. It could have come through that doorway. It could have ended my life as easily as it had presumably ended Sarah's and all the others, but it had not. It had simply made sure I knew it was there. It had warned me off its territory. The question was, what I did now with that knowledge. I could go public. I could release the footage I had captured and the photographs of the prints and the claw marks. I could tell the media everything I knew about the disappearances and the pattern stretching back decades, but I knew what would happen. I would be labeled a crank, a hoaxer, someone who had spent too much time alone in the woods and cracked under the pressure. The footage would be dismissed as a man in a suit. The prints would be called fakes. The disappearances would remain officially unsolved, but unofficially attributed to accidents and poor judgment. No one wanted to believe that something like this existed. No one wanted to accept that there were still dark places in the world where humans were not the apex predator. The alternative was to say nothing, to put in for a transfer and leave Thornwood behind, to let the forest keep its secrets and hope that the thing in the woods would return to whatever cycle of behavior had kept it hidden for so long. But that meant abandoning Sarah and all the others. It meant knowing people would continue to hike these trails and that some of them would not return. It meant living with the knowledge that I had failed in the most fundamental duty of a ranger, which is to protect people in my care. I spent those 2 days in a haze of indecision and fear. On the 3rd day, the decision was made for me. I received a radio call from a day hiker who had found a body on the Widow's Creek Trail in almost the exact location where Sarah's camera had been discovered. I drove to the trailhead and hiked in with 2 rangers from the Southern District. We found the body lying in the middle of the trail, covered with branches and leaves in a deliberate attempt at concealment. It was not Sarah. It was a man, middle-aged, wearing hiking gear. He had been dead for perhaps 2 weeks based on the state of decomposition. There were massive injuries to his torso and neck. The medical examiner would later rule the death was caused by a large predatory animal, but would note that the specific pattern of injuries was inconsistent with known bear or mountain lion behavior. What struck me most was his face. His eyes were open, and even in death they held an expression of absolute terror. Whatever he had seen in his final moments had been beyond comprehension. We searched the area and found his pack 50 yards from the body, torn open and scattered. His wallet identified him as Robert Sykes from California, 46 years old, married with 3 children. He had signed in at the trailhead 6 days ago and had been reported missing by his wife when he failed to return. Another disappearance that had slipped through the cracks. Another person who had encountered something in these woods and paid the ultimate price. I helped load the body onto the stretcher, and I hiked out with the others, and I filed the required paperwork. That night I made my decision. I could not leave. I could not transfer away and pretend I did not know what was out there. I had to do something, even if that something was futile. I began a systematic campaign of documentation. Every night I reviewed old files and cross-referenced them with my own observations. I compiled a database of every disappearance, every strange report, every piece of physical evidence I had collected. I organized the photographs and video footage. I wrote detailed accounts of everything I had experienced. I created a comprehensive file that laid out the pattern and the evidence in terms that could not be easily dismissed. I stored copies of everything in multiple locations. I sent an encrypted file to a friend who worked as a journalist in Seattle. I left detailed instructions that if anything happened to me, the information should be released to the public. It was a form of insurance and perhaps also a death wish. Because I knew that by compiling this evidence, by refusing to let it go, I was painting a target on my back. The creature had warned me once. It had let me leave the Fletcher station alive. It would not be so generous a second time. The weeks that followed were tense and strange. I continued my regular duties, but I did so with constant awareness of the forest around me. I never hiked alone without my pistol. I never went anywhere remote without telling someone exactly where I would be and when I would return. I checked my trail cameras religiously. Most showed nothing unusual, but occasionally I would find one smashed or missing entirely. Twice more I found footage of the creature, always at night, always distant, moving through the forest with that same purposeful gait. It was following me. I understood that now. Just as it had stalked Sarah and Robert Sykes and all the others, it was tracking me, learning my patterns, waiting for the right moment. I began sleeping poorly. I would wake at night convinced I heard footsteps outside my cabin in town or breathing beneath my window. I started keeping the lights on constantly. My neighbors probably thought I was losing my mind. Maybe I was. In mid-August, a family reported that their teenage son had become separated from them on a day hike near Deadfall Curve. A search was organized immediately. I joined the effort along with a dozen other rangers and volunteers. We found the boy within 6 hours, alive and unharmed, sitting on a fallen log 2 miles from where he had last been seen. He was in shock. He would not speak for the first hour except to say over and over that he had seen something. When he finally calmed down enough to give a coherent statement, he described hiding in a hollow tree while something massive walked past him. He said it had been looking for him, moving back and forth through the area, and that he had stayed absolutely still and quiet until it moved on. He said it walked on 2 legs like a man, but was huge and covered in dark hair and smelled like death. His parents took him home. The official report stated he had become disoriented and frightened. No mention was made of what he claimed to have seen. But I knew he was telling the truth. I recognized the look in his eyes. That same terrible understanding that something impossible and ancient was out there in the forest. The boy had been lucky. He had hidden and stayed silent, and the creature had moved on. But his luck would not hold forever for anyone who hiked these woods. None of our luck would. I started having a recurring dream. In the dream, I was hiking through Thornwood at dusk, and I knew something was following me, but I could not see it. I could hear its footsteps behind me, heavy and slow, matching my pace exactly. If I sped up, it sped up. If I stopped, it stopped. The dream always ended the same way. I would turn around to finally confront whatever was following me, and I would see it standing there in the trail perhaps 20 feet away, 9 feet tall, hunched and massive, eyes reflecting what little light remained. And in the dream I understood that it had been following me not to hunt me, but to show me something. It would extend one long arm and point toward the forest, and I would look in that direction and see dozens of bodies hanging from the trees, wrapped in vines and slowly decaying. Sarah and Robert and Thomas Webb and all the others. The creature's collection, its territory marked with death. I would wake from that dream gasping and covered in sweat. I tried to convince myself that I was just stressed, that the dream meant nothing, but I could not shake the feeling that it was more than a dream, that it was a message, that the creature wanted me to know what I was dealing with. In late August, I received a call from my supervisor, Gerald Hutchins. He was coming to Thornwood for an inspection. He wanted to review operations and discuss several concerns that had been raised about inconsistencies in my reports. I knew what that meant. Someone had noticed I was asking too many questions. Someone had looked at my pattern of behavior over the past months and decided I needed to be reined in or removed. Gerald arrived on a Thursday afternoon. He was a thin man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the soft hands of someone who spent his life behind a desk. We did a cursory inspection of the Ridgeline station, and then he suggested we take a walk to discuss things privately. We hiked a short distance down a maintained trail, and then Gerald stopped and turned to face me. He asked me directly if I was all right, if the job was becoming too much, if I needed to take an extended leave. I told him I was fine. He looked at me with something like pity and said he had read my reports. He said he understood I was troubled by the disappearances, but that I needed to accept that these things happened in wild places. People made mistakes. People got lost. People died. It was tragic, but it was part of working in wilderness management. I asked him about the pattern, about the fact that 17 people had vanished in Thornwood over 40 years under similar circumstances. He sighed and said that was not actually unusual for a park of this size, that most national forests had comparable numbers, that I was seeing connections where none existed. I asked him about the physical evidence, the claw marks, the footprints, the footage I had captured. He looked uncomfortable then. He said he had seen the photos I had submitted and that they were interesting but hardly conclusive, that the scientific community would require far more substantial evidence before taking claims about unknown species seriously, that my responsibility was to the living visitors to the park, not to chase what was almost certainly nothing more than misidentification and coincidence. Then he said something that made my blood run cold. He said that if I continued down this path, I would be removed from my position, that the Park Service could not have rangers spreading rumors about monsters in the forest, that it was bad for tourism and bad for my career and bad for everyone involved. He said this gently, almost kindly, but the threat was clear. I nodded. I told him I understood. I said I would refocus on my regular duties and stop pursuing these investigations. He seemed relieved. He clapped me on the shoulder and said he was glad to hear it. We hiked back to the station, and he left that afternoon, and I watched his car disappear down the access road, and I knew that I had just lied to my supervisor for the first time in my career. Because I was not going to stop. I could not stop. Too many people were dead. Too many questions remained unanswered, and I had seen that creature with my own eyes, captured it on video, documented its existence in ways that should matter. If the Park Service would not act, then I would have to find another way. I spent the next 2 weeks making preparations. I gathered supplies and equipment. I studied everything I had learned about the creature's behavior. I identified the areas where it seemed to spend most of its time, the routes it used to move through the forest, the locations where it had been most active. I formulated a plan that was equal parts research expedition and suicide mission. I would hike deep into the northwest quadrant of Thornwood, into the most remote and rugged terrain, and I would find the creature's territory. I would document everything I could, and I would stream the footage live to secure cloud storage so that even if something happened to me, the evidence would survive. It was insane. I knew it was insane, but I could not live with the alternative, which was to walk away and pretend that everything was normal. I informed the regional office that I would be taking a week of vacation. I told my few friends in town that I was going to visit family. I prepared my gear, and I wrote letters to be delivered if I did not return. One to my sister explaining where I had gone and why. One to the journalist in Seattle authorizing him to release all the evidence I had compiled. One to Sarah's parents apologizing for failing to find answers sooner. I sealed those letters and left them with my attorney with instructions to mail them if I did not check in within 10 days. On a Wednesday morning in early September, I drove to a remote trailhead at the far northwestern edge of the park. I shouldered my pack, and I activated the live streaming cameras I had rigged to my gear, and I walked into the forest. The sky was overcast, and the air smelled like rain. The trees closed around me, and the modern world fell away. I was entering territory that humans had never truly controlled, no matter how many trails we cut or maps we drew. I was walking into a darkness that had existed long before me and would continue long after I was gone. The first day I hiked hard, covering nearly 12 miles through increasingly difficult terrain. I passed beyond the maintained trails and followed game paths and compass bearings into country I had never visited. The forest here was old, cathedral quiet, the trees massive and spaced far apart. Ferns covered the ground in thick green carpets. Fallen logs the size of cars slowly dissolved back into the earth. I saw no animals. I heard no birds. The silence was profound. I made camp that evening in a small clearing beside a creek. I set up my tent and ate a cold dinner, and I sat in the gathering darkness listening to the water move over stones. Nothing disturbed me that night, but I slept poorly, waking at every small sound, convinced each time that something massive was approaching through the trees. The second day took me deeper. I climbed through a series of steep ravines and over a ridge that gave me views of miles of untouched forest stretching in every direction. I was truly remote now, farther from help than I had ever been. If something happened to me here, it would be days before anyone even noticed I was missing, and weeks before anyone found my body, if they ever did. I found the first real sign of the creature late that afternoon. A massive tree had been stripped of its bark in a spiral pattern that ran from ground level to 20 feet up. The exposed wood underneath was scored with deep parallel gouges. This was a boundary marker, I realized, a claim of territory. I was getting close. I made camp early that evening in a location that gave me good visibility in all directions. I positioned my cameras to cover every approach. I built a small fire, something I normally would not have done in these conditions, but I wanted light, and I wanted the creature to know I was here. If it was going to come for me, I wanted it to happen on my terms. I sat beside that fire as night fell, and I thought about all the decisions that had led me to this moment. Every choice I could have made differently. Every point where I could have walked away. But I had not walked away. And now here I was, sitting alone in the deepest wilderness of Thornwood, waiting for a creature that should not exist to emerge from the darkness and show itself. The knocking started around 10 p.m. 3 deep, booming knocks from somewhere to the north. Then silence. Then 3 more from the east. Then the south. Then the west. It was circling me, announcing its presence, letting me know I was surrounded. I stood and moved away from the fire so my eyes could adjust to the darkness. I activated all my cameras and made sure they were streaming properly. Whatever happened next would be recorded. The knocking stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, a void of sound that pressed against my eardrums. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving through the forest toward my position. I waited. The footsteps stopped at the edge of the clearing, perhaps 40 yards away. I shined my flashlight in that direction and saw nothing but trees and darkness. I called out. I said I was not here to hurt it. I said I only wanted to understand. My voice sounded small and pathetic in that vast silence. No response. Then a sound I had not heard before. A vocalization, deep and resonant, somewhere between a growl and a roar, but with an articulation that suggested language. It lasted perhaps 5 seconds, and it raised every hair on my body. It was not trying to scare me, it was trying to communicate. I called out again. I said I wanted to talk. I said I knew it was intelligent. I said I knew it had been here long before humans arrived. Another vocalization, different this time, shorter and sharper. Then the sound of something massive moving through the underbrush off to my right. I spun and caught a glimpse of it in my flashlight beam, 9 feet tall, covered in dark matted hair, moving between trees with fluid grace despite its size. Then it was gone, vanished into the shadows. My heart was hammering. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I forced myself to stay still. Running was what prey did. I was not prey. I was here as an observer, a witness. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The forest remained silent. Then from behind me came the sound of breathing, deep and slow, very close. I turned slowly, afraid of what I would see. It was standing at the far edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of my firelight. I could see its outline, massive and hunched. Could see its eyes reflecting my flashlight in bright amber circles. We looked at each other across 30 feet of darkness, and I felt something pass between us. Recognition, understanding. It knew I was not a threat. It knew I was here to document, not to harm. And it was choosing to let me see it, to let me bear witness to its existence. I raised my camera slowly. The creature did not move. I took photographs. I kept my movements slow and deliberate. I spoke softly, thanking it, telling it I understood the weight of what it was showing me. It stood there for perhaps 30 seconds. Then it turned and walked into the forest, and the darkness swallowed it, and it was gone. I stood in that clearing, shaking, not from fear, but from awe and a profound sense of privilege. I had seen it, really seen it, and it had allowed me that sight. I had my proof now. Video and photographs captured from mere yards away. Evidence that could not be dismissed or explained away. Evidence that would force the world to acknowledge that something ancient and intelligent still lived in these forests. I should have left then. I should have packed my gear and hiked out immediately while I still could, but I did not. Because I understood now that this was not just about proof. It was about something deeper, about respecting a creature that had every reason to kill me, but had chosen not to, about honoring the trust it had shown by revealing itself. I sat by my fire until dawn. The creature did not return, but I could feel its presence in the forest around me, watching, waiting. When morning came, I broke camp and I began the long hike back toward civilization. I walked slowly, respectfully, stopping often to listen to the forest. I saw no further sign of the creature, but twice I heard knocking in the distance, that same pattern of 3, acknowledgement perhaps that I was leaving its territory. I made it back to my truck by late afternoon of the 3rd day. I was exhausted and filthy, and my supplies were depleted, but I was alive, and I had what I had come for. I drove back to town, and I went directly to my apartment, and I reviewed all the footage and photographs I had captured. They were clear, undeniable. The creature standing at the edge of the clearing, visible in the firelight and the camera flash, its face partly visible, that strange blend of ape and human features, its eyes looking directly at the camera with unmistakable intelligence. I had done it. I had proof. I spent that evening organizing everything and preparing to release it all to the world. The photographs, the video, the complete file of evidence I had compiled over the months. Tomorrow I would send it to major news outlets. I would contact wildlife researchers. I would force the world to acknowledge what I had found. But as I sat there looking at that image of the creature, at those intelligent eyes staring back at me, I felt a growing uncertainty. What would happen when this went public? There would be an immediate rush of interest. Researchers and thrill-seekers and hunters would flood into Thornwood. The creature's territory would be invaded. Its ancient, peaceful existence would be shattered. And what then? Would it be captured, killed, made into a spectacle? I had spent months terrified of this being, had seen it as a threat and a monster. But sitting there looking at the evidence I had gathered, I saw something else. I saw a creature that had lived hidden in these forests for perhaps thousands of years. A creature that had survived by avoiding humans, by taking only occasionally what it needed, by maintaining a balance that we would never understand. Yes, people had died. Sarah and Robert and Thomas and all the others. That was terrible and tragic. But they had entered its territory. They had ventured into places that had never truly been ours. In any wilderness there are dangers. There are predators and hazards and the risk of death. We accept that when we step off the pavement and into the wild, this creature was part of that wilderness. Removing it or exposing it would not make Thornwood safer. It would only destroy something rare and ancient and irreplaceable. I sat there until very late, struggling with this decision. The responsible thing, the thing any rational person would do, was to release the evidence and let the proper authorities handle it. But I had seen the Park Service response. I knew what would happen. There would be a hunt. There would be media circus. There would be an end to something that had existed since before any of us were born. In the early hours of morning, I made my choice. I deleted everything: the photographs, the video, the streaming footage, all the evidence I had risked my life to capture. I erased it systematically and thoroughly, wiping the drives and destroying the memory cards. I kept only my written notes, my personal documentation of what I had experienced. That would be enough for me. The world did not need to know. Some things should remain hidden. Some mysteries should stay unsolved. The next morning, I drove back to the Ridgeline station and I filed a report stating that my vacation time had been restful and that I was ready to return to regular duties. I told no one what I had done or what I had seen. Life at Thornwood returned to what passed for normal. Hikers came and went. Rangers patrolled the trails. The forest continued its ancient cycles. I continued my work and I watched carefully for any signs that the creature was active, but the rest of that fall was quiet. No disappearances, no strange reports. The knocking sounds that had been common in the summer faded away. It was as if the creature had retreated deep into its territory, satisfied that the threat I represented was gone. I think about Sarah often, about her parents who never got answers, about all the families who lost people to these woods. I carry that weight, and I always will. But I believe I made the right choice. Some things are bigger than individual justice. Some things matter more than closure. In November, I requested and received approval for a new position at a different national forest 3 states away. I told people I needed a change of scenery. The truth was, I could not stay at Thornwood anymore. Not because I was afraid, though I was, but because I had become something I had not anticipated. I had become a keeper of secrets, a guardian of mysteries, and that was not a role I could sustain in a place where I was expected to tell the full truth about conditions and hazards. My last day at Thornwood was in early December. Snow had begun to fall in the high country, and the forest had that hushed quality that comes with winter. I hiked out to the Fletcher station one final time. The structure looked even more decrepit than before, halfway to falling down, soon to be fully reclaimed by the forest. I went inside. The circle of bones was still there in the main room, but it had been rearranged. The human objects were gone, removed, or perhaps taken elsewhere. Only the small bones remained, arranged now in a spiral pattern that reminded me of the bark stripped from that tree. A message, perhaps, or simply art. I stood there for a long time, and then I spoke aloud. I said I was leaving. I said I was sorry for intruding. I said I hoped it could return to its peace, and that others would respect its territory even if they did not know why. I do not know if it heard me. I do not know if it understood. But as I turned to leave, I heard a single knock from somewhere in the forest outside. Acknowledgement. Farewell. I walked away from the Fletcher station, and I did not look back. I hiked out of Thornwood that afternoon, and I have never returned. I work now in a different forest, in a different state, and I do my job well. I help hikers and maintain trails, and I sleep soundly most nights. But sometimes, usually in the deep hours before dawn, I wake to perfect silence, and I remember what it felt like to stand in that clearing and see those amber eyes looking back at me from the darkness. I remember the weight of that moment, the privilege and the terror of it. And I wonder if I will ever experience anything like that again, or if that was the singular defining moment of my life, the point where everything changed and could never change back. People still disappear in Thornwood. I check the news sometimes and I see the reports. A hiker here, a hunter there. The official explanations are always the same. Accidents, exposure, poor judgment. The forest keeps its secrets and the creature continues its ancient existence, and the world goes on not knowing what lives in those deep woods. I think about writing this down sometimes, creating a record of what really happened. But what would be the point? No one would believe it. And even if they did, what good would come from that knowledge? Better to let the mystery remain. Better to let people walk those trails in blissful ignorance than in paralyzing fear. But I will say this. If you ever find yourself hiking alone in deep forest and you feel suddenly that you are being watched, trust that instinct. If you hear knocking sounds echoing through the trees in patterns of 3, turn back. If you come across a trail that feels wrong in a way you cannot explain, choose a different path. If you see massive prints in the mud or claw marks scored deep into tree bark, or a clearing where the birds do not sing, leave immediately and do not return. There are places in this world that humans were never meant to claim fully. There are beings older and stranger than we can comprehend. They allow us to pass through their domain most of the time, but they are not bound by our rules or our understanding. They are the true owners of the wild places. And sometimes, rarely but inevitably, they remind us of that fact. I learned that lesson at Thornwood. I learned it at great cost, and I carry it with me every day. The forest is not empty. It has never been empty. And what lives there, patient and ancient and utterly beyond our control, is watching still. I signed the contract in early June, inside a cramped Forest Service office that smelled of wet nylon and burned coffee. The woman behind the desk never looked at me, just slid the papers over and tapped where I needed to sign. Orientation was at 7 in the morning the next day. No welcome, no questions. The title sounded official, Natural Resources Technician. But the work was simple. Long boat runs, empty islands, reports no one read. I took every assignment they offered, especially the ones no one else wanted. Early departures, rough water, days without cell service, anything that kept me out of town. In Alaska, isolation was not a side effect of the job. It was the job. My name is Samuel Whitmore, and I came to the Tongass National Forest to disappear. Not in the literal sense, though after everything that happened, I understand how thin that line really is. I came because I needed distance from the life I had been living in Oregon, a failed marriage, a business that collapsed, a brother I could no longer speak to without shouting. Alaska promised silence, and for a while, it delivered. The Tongass is the largest national forest in the United States. 17 million acres of temperate rainforest spanning the Alexander Archipelago and the coastal mountains of southeast Alaska. Most people picture Alaska as a frozen wasteland, but the Tongass is different. It is wet, it is green, it is dense in ways that forests in the lower 48 cannot comprehend. The trees here, Sitka spruce, western hemlock, red cedar, grow so thick that sunlight becomes a rumor. The moss hangs from every branch like the hair of drowned women. The rain never stops, not really. It just pauses long enough to let you forget it is coming. I was stationed out of Ketchikan, a small town built on a rocky island at the southern tip of the archipelago. The locals called it the salmon capital of the world, though I never saw much evidence of that title during my time there. What I saw were fishing boats, float planes, and a constant gray ceiling of clouds that seemed to press down on everything. The town itself clung to the mountainside like it was afraid of falling into the water. The streets were steep, the buildings were old, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. I rented a room above a bait shop on Creek Street. The floor sloped, the walls were thin, and I could hear the water running beneath the building at all hours. It was perfect. I did not want comfort. I wanted to be reminded, constantly, that I was somewhere else, somewhere far from everything I had known. My supervisor was a man named Franklin Delacroix. He was 63 years old, had worked for the Forest Service for 41 years, and possessed the kind of quiet authority that made younger men listen without question. He was tall and lean, with a gray beard that he kept trimmed close to his jaw and eyes that had seen too much water. Franklin never raised his voice. He never needed to. When he told you something, you believed it. Not because he demanded belief, but because everything about him suggested he had earned the right to be taken seriously. On my third day, Franklin called me into his office, a converted storage room at the back of the Ketchikan Ranger Station. The walls were covered with maps, most of them hand-annotated with faded pencil marks. There were photographs too, black and white images of men standing in front of boats and cabins, their faces serious, their clothes soaked. Franklin gestured for me to sit. I did. He studied me for a long moment before speaking. His voice was low and even, like a boat engine idling in calm water. "You came here to get away from something," he said. "That is not a question. I can see it in how you move. how you avoid eye contact, how you volunteered for the Heseda run before you even knew what it was. I did not respond. There was nothing to say. Franklin nodded slowly, as if my silence confirmed something he already knew. That is fine, he said. Most of the men who work this job are running from something. The forest does not care why you came. It only cares whether you can do the work. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands across his stomach. But I need to tell you something, Samuel. Something that is not in the manual. Something that orientation did not cover. I waited. Franklin's eyes drifted to the window. Outside, the rain was falling in sheets, turning the harbor into a gray blur. There are places in the Tongass that do not appear on any official map, he said. Islands that the Forest Service knows about but does not acknowledge. Cabins that were built by men whose names have been forgotten. Trails that lead to nowhere, or worse, to somewhere. He paused, letting the words settle. You will hear stories from the old-timers, he continued. Stories about people who went into the forest and never came back. Stories about sounds in the night that do not match any animal in the region. Stories about things seen at the edge of the tree line, just before dark. I wanted to laugh. I wanted to tell him that I was too old for campfire tales, that I had not come to Alaska to be frightened by ghost stories. But something in his expression stopped me. He was not trying to scare me. He was trying to warn me. Most of those stories are nonsense, Franklin said. Exaggerations, misremembered details. The human mind does strange things when it is alone for too long. But some of those stories, Samuel, some of them are true. And if you work this job long enough, you will have your own story to tell. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to me. I have been doing this for 4 decades, he said. I have seen things I cannot explain. Things I have never reported because no one would believe me. Things I have never told my wife or my children or anyone outside this office. He turned to face me, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I had not expected. Fear. Not the sharp, immediate fear of a man facing danger, but the slow, deep fear of a man who has lived with something terrible for a very long time. The Tongass is not just a forest, Samuel. It is something older. Something that was here before the Tlingit, before the glaciers, before anything that we would recognize as life. And it remembers. It remembers everything. He walked back to his desk and sat down heavily, as if the conversation had drained something from him. I am not telling you this to scare you, he said. I am telling you this because you need to know. Because when you are out there, alone, and something happens that does not make sense, I want you to remember this conversation. I want you to know that you are not crazy, that other men have seen what you will see, and that the best thing you can do when you see it is to leave. Do not investigate. Do not try to understand. Just leave. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick manila folder, which he slid across the desk toward me. This is your first real assignment, he said. His voice had returned to its normal, business-like tone, as if the previous conversation had never happened. Heseda Island, 3-day survey. You will be checking on one of our remote cabins and documenting any wildlife activity in the area. Simple work. I picked up the folder and opened it. Inside were maps, photographs, and a series of typed reports dating back to the 1970s. The cabin in question was located on the northern shore of Heseda Island, accessible only by boat. The nearest town was Craig, about 20 miles to the east. The reports were routine: weather observations, wildlife sightings, maintenance notes. Nothing unusual. You will leave tomorrow morning at 6, Franklin said. Take the whaler. Pack for 4 days, just in case the weather turns. There is a satellite phone in the cabin, but the reception is unreliable. If you need to reach us, use the radio. I nodded and stood to leave. At the door, I paused and looked back at Franklin. He was staring at the window again, his face unreadable. What happened to the last person who had this assignment? I asked. Franklin did not turn around. He quit, he said. After 3 weeks, said he could not sleep anymore. Said he kept hearing voices outside the cabin at night, voices that knew his name. I waited for him to continue, but he said nothing more. I left the office and walked out into the rain, the folder tucked under my arm, Franklin's words echoing in my head. The Tongass is not just a forest. It is something older, something that remembers. At the time, I thought he was being dramatic. I thought it was some kind of initiation ritual, a way of testing the new guy, seeing if he would spook easily. I had no idea how wrong I was. I had no idea what was waiting for me on Heseda Island. I had no idea that by the end of that summer, I would understand exactly what Franklin meant. And that understanding would change everything I thought I knew about the world, about the forest, and about myself. I left Ketchikan at 6 in the morning, just as Franklin had instructed. The sky was the color of wet concrete, and a light rain was falling, turning the harbor into a forest of masts and rigging that swayed gently in the early morning swell. The boat was a 22-foot Boston whaler, painted Forest Service green, with a center console and a canvas top that did little to keep out the rain. I loaded my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food for 4 days, water, first aid kit, rifle, ammunition, radio, flashlight, extra batteries, rain gear, maps, compass, notebook, camera, and cast off from the dock at 6:15. The crossing to Heceta Island took about 4 hours. I followed the inside passage, threading my way between islands that rose from the water like the humped backs of sleeping giants. The forest came right down to the shoreline on most of them, a solid wall of green that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Occasionally, I would pass a fishing boat or a kayaker, but for the most part, I was alone on the water, surrounded by silence broken only by the steady drone of the outboard motor. I had studied the maps the night before, memorizing the route, noting the landmarks, identifying the hazards. Heceta Island was one of the larger islands in the archipelago, about 40 miles long and 10 miles wide at its widest point. Most of it was uninhabited, covered with old-growth forest that had never been logged. There were a few small settlements on the eastern shore, mostly fishing camps and seasonal cabins, but the northern shore, where the Forest Service cabin was located, was completely wild. The cabin itself had been built in 1932 by a man named Ezekiel Marsh. According to the reports in the folder, Marsh was a trapper who had come to Alaska during the Depression, hoping to make his fortune in furs. He built the cabin as a base of operations, spending his winters running trap lines through the forest and his summers fishing for salmon in the surrounding waters. He lived there alone for 18 years, until 1950, when he simply disappeared. His cabin was found empty, his boat still tied to the dock, his gear still inside. There was food on the table, as if he had been in the middle of a meal when something interrupted him. The Forest Service acquired the cabin in 1954 and had been using it as a remote station ever since. Dozens of rangers and researchers had stayed there over the years, conducting surveys, monitoring wildlife, maintaining trails. Most of them reported nothing unusual, but a few, a small but persistent minority, reported experiences that did not fit neatly into any official category. Strange sounds at night, the feeling of being watched, objects that moved when no one was looking, and in 3 separate cases, the same detail that Franklin had mentioned, voices outside the cabin that knew the listener's name. I arrived at Heceta Island just before 11 in the morning. The rain had stopped, but the sky was still overcast, and a thick mist hung over the water, reducing visibility to a few hundred yards. I followed the shoreline north, using my compass and the occasional landmark to navigate, until I spotted the cabin, a small wooden structure set back from the water on a low bluff, surrounded by towering spruce trees. The dock was old but sturdy, built from logs that had weathered to a silvery gray. I tied off the whaler and climbed onto the planks, my boots echoing in the silence. The air smelled of salt and pine and something else, something faintly organic that I could not identify. Decay maybe, or moss, or something that had been dead for a very long time. The cabin was exactly as the photographs had shown it, a single-story structure with a pitched roof, a small porch, and 2 windows facing the water. The walls were made of hand-hewn logs, chinked with some kind of gray morite that had cracked and crumbled in places. The roof was covered with cedar shakes, many of them missing or broken. The door was painted red, though the paint had faded and peeled until it was more pink than anything else. I climbed the steps to the porch and tried the door. It was unlocked, as Franklin had said it would be. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was dim and musty, lit only by the gray light filtering through the dirty windows. There was a single room, about 15 feet square, with a wooden floor, a stone fireplace, a narrow bed against one wall, a table and 2 chairs in the center, and a small kitchen area in the back corner. The walls were bare except for a few hooks where previous occupants had hung their gear. There was a layer of dust on everything, and the air had that particular stillness that comes from long disuse. I set down my pack and walked slowly around the room, taking inventory. The fireplace was cold, the ashes long since turned to powder. The bed was made, the blankets folded neatly at the foot. The table was clear except for an old kerosene lantern and a stack of yellowed papers that turned out to be survey forms from 1987. The kitchen had a hand pump for water, a propane stove that looked like it dated from the 50s, and a row of cabinets that contained a few cans of beans, some instant coffee, and a family of mice that fled when I opened the door. In the back corner, I found the satellite phone and the radio, both mounted on a small shelf. I tested the radio first, It crackled to life, and I was able to raise the Ketchikan station on the second try. I reported my arrival, confirmed my schedule, and signed off. The satellite phone was another matter. When I picked it up, the screen was blank. I checked the battery, checked the connections, tried turning it on and off several times. Nothing. It was completely dead. I made a note in my notebook. Satellite phone inoperative. Will report to station on return, and continued my inspection. The last thing I found was a trapdoor in the floor, near the back of the cabin. It was about 3 feet square, set flush with the floorboards, with a heavy iron ring for a handle. I pulled it open and shone my flashlight into the darkness below. The beam revealed a small root cellar, maybe 6 feet deep and 8 feet across, with earthen walls and a dirt floor. There were a few shelves along the walls, holding jars of what looked like preserved vegetables, long since turned to brown sludge. There was also a wooden crate in the center of the floor, nailed shut. I climbed down the ladder and examined the crate. It was old, very old, and the wood was soft with rot. The nails were rusted, and when I pulled at one of the boards, it came away easily. Inside the crate, wrapped in oilcloth, were the personal effects of Ezekiel Marsh. There was a leather-bound journal, the pages brittle and yellow. There was a pocket watch, stopped at 3:17. There was a photograph of a woman I did not recognize, her face stern and unsmiling in the way of old portraits. And there was a knife. A hunting knife with a bone handle and a blade that was still sharp despite the decades. I took the journal and left the rest. I climbed back up the ladder, closed the trap door, and sat down at the table to read. The journal began in 1932, the year Marsh built the cabin. The early entries were mundane, notes about construction, weather observations, lists of supplies, accounts of successful hunts. Marsh wrote in a cramped, careful hand, his spelling inconsistent, but his meaning clear. He was a practical man, focused on survival, with little time for reflection or philosophy. But as I read further, the tone of the entries began to change. By 1935, Marsh was writing about things that did not fit the pattern of the earlier pages. He mentioned sounds in the forest at night, sounds that he could not identify, that did not match any animal he knew. He wrote about the feeling of being watched, a constant presence that he could sense but never see. He described dreams, vivid, disturbing dreams in which he wandered through the forest, searching for something he could never find, pursued by something he could never escape. In 1938, the entries became more fragmented. Marsh wrote about seeing figures at the edge of the tree line, tall, thin shapes that moved in ways that did not seem natural. He wrote about voices that called to him from the forest, voices that knew his name, that whispered secrets he could not quite hear. He wrote about losing time, hours, sometimes entire days, that he could not account for, that left no memory except a vague sense of dread. The final entry was dated October 15, 1949, 6 months before Marsh disappeared. It was shorter than the others, just a few lines scrawled in a hand that trembled. "It is here," he wrote. "It has always been here. I understand now. I know what it wants. I know what I have to do. May God forgive me." I closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin, the weight of those words pressing down on me. Outside, the mist had thickened, and the forest was invisible, swallowed by a gray wall that seemed to press against the windows. The only sound was the soft drip of water from the eaves, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat. I told myself that Marsh was crazy, that 18 years alone in the wilderness had broken something in his mind, that the things he described, the sounds, the figures, the voices, were nothing more than the hallucinations of a man who had spent too long without human contact. I told myself that there was a rational explanation for everything. I told myself that I was not afraid. But as I sat there, in that dim and dusty cabin, listening to the silence of the forest, I felt something I had not expected, a sense of recognition, a feeling that I had been here before, in a place just like this, in a moment just like this, waiting for something I could not name. It was not fear exactly, it was more like anticipation, like the forest was watching me, weighing me, deciding what to do, and somewhere, deep in the trees, something was waiting. I spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking my gear and making the cabin habitable. I swept the floors, aired out the blankets, checked the propane stove, and gathered enough firewood to last several days. The work was simple and physical, and it helped to quiet the unease that had settled over me since reading Marsh's journal. By the time I finished, it was late afternoon, and the mist had begun to lift. I walked down to the dock and stood there for a while, watching the water. The surface was calm, almost glassy, reflecting the dark shapes of the trees on the opposite shore. There were no birds, no fish jumping, no sound except the soft lap of water against the pilings. I had never been in a place so quiet. It was not peaceful, it was empty, as if the world had been drained of something essential, leaving only the shell behind. I returned to the cabin as the light began to fade. I cooked a simple dinner, beans, rice, coffee, and ate at the table, the kerosene lantern casting a flickering circle of light around me. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper than they should have been, and I found myself glancing toward the windows more often than was necessary, half expecting to see something looking back. After dinner, I took out my notebook and began writing my report. Wildlife observations, none so far. Weather conditions, overcast. Light rain in the morning, mist in the afternoon, clearing toward evening. Cabin status, habitable but in need of repair. Satellite phone inoperative, radio functional. I was just finishing the last paragraph when I heard it. A sound, outside the cabin. Not loud, barely audible in fact, but distinct. A footstep. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The sound came again, and again. Slow, deliberate footsteps circling the cabin. I set down my pen and listened. The footsteps continued, moving around the perimeter of the cabin with a measured, unhurried pace. There was no variation in the rhythm, no hesitation, no acceleration. Just step, 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 like a metronome. I stood up slowly, trying not to make any noise. I reached for the rifle I had leaned against the wall and checked that it was loaded. Then I moved to the window and looked out. The light was almost gone, and the forest was a wall of black shapes against a dark gray sky. I could see the dock, the water, the first few feet of the path that led into the trees, but I could not see anything moving. No animal, no person, nothing. The footsteps continued. I pressed my face against the glass, straining to see. The sound was coming from the other side of the cabin now, from the direction of the forest. Step, step, step. Always the same rhythm, always the same pace. I crossed to the other window and looked out. Nothing. Just trees and shadows and the impenetrable darkness of the forest at night. But the footsteps were closer now. I could hear them clearly, just outside the wall, no more than 10 feet away. Step, step, step. And then they stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, not the natural silence of the forest at night, but something deeper, something heavier. A silence that seemed to have weight, that seemed to press against the walls of the cabin like water. I stood at the window, rifle in hand, waiting. My heart was beating so hard I could feel it in my temples. My breath was shallow, rapid. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get out of the cabin, to get to the boat and leave this place and never come back. But I did not move. I could not move. I was frozen, trapped by something I did not understand, held in place by a force that was not physical but was just as real. And then I heard it. A voice. Samuel. My name. Spoken softly, almost tenderly, like a mother calling a child in for dinner. Spoken from just outside the window, no more than a few inches away. Samuel. I cannot describe the terror I felt in that moment. It was not the fear of physical danger. I have faced bears. I have faced storms. I have faced all the ordinary hazards of life in the wilderness. This was something different, something primal, something that reached into the deepest part of my brain and triggered instincts I did not know I had. I stumbled backward, away from the window, and tripped over the chair. I fell hard, the rifle clattering away across the floor. I scrambled to my feet and backed into the corner, as far from the windows as I could get, my eyes fixed on the glass. Samuel. The voice was moving now, circling the cabin, just as the footsteps had done. Samuel, come outside. Samuel, I want to show you something. Samuel. I grabbed the lantern from the table and held it up, as if the light could protect me. The flame flickered and danced, casting wild shadows on the walls. Through the window, I could see nothing but darkness, but I could feel it, a presence, just outside, watching, waiting. The voice continued, soft and patient. Samuel, you came here to disappear. I can help you. Samuel, I know what you are running from. I know what you did. Samuel, come outside. Let me show you. I do not know how long I stood there, in that corner, listening to the voice. It could have been minutes. It could have been hours. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the voice, and the darkness, and the unbearable weight of the silence between each word. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The voice fell silent. The darkness outside the window seemed to recede, to thin, to become ordinary again. The pressure in my chest eased, and I found I could breathe. I slid down the wall and sat on the floor, the lantern clutched in my hands, my whole body shaking. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the corner, the rifle across my knees, and watched the windows until the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the glass. When the sun finally rose, or what passed for a sunrise in that perpetually overcast place, I got up, packed my gear, and walked down to the dock. I was going to leave. I was going to get in the boat and go back to Ketchikan and tell Franklin that he could find someone else for this assignment. I was done. I was finished. I was not going to spend another night in that cabin. But when I reached the dock, I stopped. The boat was gone. The whaler was no longer tied to the pilings. There was no sign of it, no rope, no debris, nothing floating in the water. It had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the empty space where the boat should have been. And then, slowly, I turned and looked back at the cabin. It sat there on its low bluff, surrounded by trees, quiet and still in the early morning light. And I understood, with a cold certainty that settled into my bones, that I was not leaving. Not yet. Not until the forest was finished with me. I spent the morning searching for the boat. I walked the entire shoreline of the bay, pushing through undergrowth and scrambling over fallen trees, looking for any sign of where the whaler might have drifted. I found nothing. No wreckage, no tracks, no indication that the boat had ever been there at all. By midday, I was exhausted and frustrated. I returned to the cabin and tried the radio, hoping to reach the Ketchikan station and report my situation. The radio crackled and hissed, but I could not raise anyone on any frequency. Static, nothing but static, as if the signals were being swallowed by something between me and the rest of the world. I was alone, truly alone, cut off from civilization, from help, from any possibility of rescue. The nearest settlement was 20 miles away, across water I had no way to cross. I had food for a few more days, water from the pump, shelter, but I was trapped. I sat down at the table and tried to think. There had to be a rational explanation. The boat must have come loose during the night. A faulty knot, a frayed rope, something I had overlooked. It had drifted away with the tide, and I had simply not been able to find it. The radio was malfunctioning. These things happened in remote areas, especially in weather like this. There was nothing supernatural about any of it. Just bad luck, just coincidence. But even as I told myself these things, I knew I did not believe them. I thought about the voice, the footsteps, the way my name had been spoken, with that soft, patient certainty. Whatever was happening here was not coincidence. It was intention. Something wanted me here. Something had taken the boat to make sure I stayed. I spent the afternoon gathering more firewood and taking stock of my supplies. I had enough food for 3 days, maybe 4 if I rationed carefully. The pump was working, so water was not a problem. I had the rifle and a box of 20 cartridges. I had the flashlight and extra batteries. I had matches, a knife, rope, a first aid kit. I had everything I needed to survive. But survival was not my main concern. My main concern was making it through the coming night. As the light began to fade, I barricaded the door and windows as best I could. I pushed the table against the door and wedged the chairs under the window frames. I built a fire in the fireplace, not for warmth, but for light, as much light as I could create. I placed the lantern on the table and lit every candle I could find. I wanted the cabin to be bright. I wanted there to be no shadows. I sat in the corner, the rifle across my knees, and waited. The hours passed slowly. The fire crackled and popped. The candles flickered, the wind picked up outside, and I could hear the trees creaking and swaying in the darkness. But there were no footsteps, no voice, no presence outside the windows, just the ordinary sounds of the forest at night, the wind, the rain, the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. By midnight, I began to think that the previous night had been an anomaly, a one-time occurrence, perhaps triggered by my arrival, by my disturbance of the cabin and the cellar in the journal. Maybe I had been tested, and I had passed. Maybe whatever was out there had decided I was not worth the effort. I was just starting to relax, just starting to think about trying to sleep when I heard it. Not a voice this time, not footsteps, something else. Music. Faint, distant, carried on the wind. A melody I almost recognized, played on what sounded like a fiddle or a violin. It was coming from the forest, from somewhere deep in the trees. I went to the window and looked out. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had parted enough to let through a sliver of moonlight. I could see the dock, the water, the first few rows of trees at the edge of the clearing, and I could see something else. A light, a flickering orange light deep in the forest. It was moving, weaving between the trees, appearing and disappearing, as if it were being carried by someone walking through the woods. The music continued, growing louder, clearer. I could hear it now. An old tune, something from another era, played with a skill that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. There was a wrongness to the melody, a dissonance that crept in at the edges, as if the musician were playing from a score that had been corrupted or altered. I watched the light for a long time, trying to understand what I was seeing. It was too far away to be a threat, too deep in the forest to be anything I needed to worry about. But I could not look away. There was something hypnotic about the combination of the light and the music, something that tugged at the edge of my consciousness, that whispered of secrets just beyond my understanding. And then the light stopped moving. It hovered there, in the darkness between the trees, pulsing gently like a heartbeat. The music faded, replaced by silence, and I realized, with a chill that ran down my spine, that the light was not random. It was not wandering. It was waiting. It was waiting for me to come to it. I stepped back from the window and forced myself to look away. I knew, with a certainty that came from somewhere deeper than thought, that if I went into the forest, I would not come back. Whatever was out there, whatever was making that light, playing that music, it was not human, and it did not have my best interests at heart. I returned to my corner and did not look at the window again. The music started up once more, louder this time, closer. The melody had changed. It was faster now, more urgent, with a driving rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. I covered my ears and closed my eyes, but I could still hear it, still feel it vibrating in my chest, in my bones. Samuel. The voice was back, softer than before, almost a whisper, but I could hear it clearly over the music. Samuel. Come dance with me. Samuel. I have been waiting so long. Samuel. I pressed my hands harder against my ears. I started humming, singing, anything to drown out the voice. I recited the Pledge of Allegiance, the Lord's Prayer, the lyrics to every song I could remember. I talked to myself, to the walls, to anyone who might be listening. Anything to fill the silence, anything to keep that voice from getting inside my head. And somehow, I made it through. The music faded. The voice stopped. The light in the forest winked out, leaving only darkness. When dawn came, I was still in my corner, my throat raw from talking, my hands trembling, my mind racing. I had survived another night, but I knew I could not do this forever. I knew that whatever was out there, it was patient. It had all the time in the world, and sooner or later, it would get what it wanted. On the third day, I read more of Ezekiel Marsh's journal. I had been avoiding it, reluctant to delve deeper into the mind of a man who had clearly been driven mad by this place. But I was desperate. I needed to understand what I was dealing with. I needed to know if there was a way out. The middle sections of the journal were difficult to read. Marsh's handwriting had deteriorated, becoming cramped and erratic, the letters running together in ways that made many passages illegible. But I was able to piece together the general arc of his experience. Marsh had first noticed something wrong in the winter of 1934, about 2 years after he built the cabin. He had been running his trap lines, following a route he had traveled dozens of times before, when he realized he was lost. The forest had changed. Landmarks he knew were gone, replaced by trees and rocks that he did not recognize. He wandered for hours, growing increasingly disoriented, until he stumbled, quite by accident, back to the cabin. He had been less than a mile from home the entire time. After that, the incidents increased. He would hear voices calling his name in the forest, voices that sounded like people he knew, people from his past, people who were hundreds or thousands of miles away. He would see figures at the edge of his vision, always just out of clear sight, always gone when he turned to look. He would lose time, fall asleep in the afternoon, and wake up the next morning with no memory of the intervening hours. By 1940, Marsh had developed a theory. He believed that the forest was not just a collection of trees and animals, but a living thing, a consciousness, something old and vast and patient, that had existed on this island long before humans arrived and would exist long after they were gone. He called it the presence, and he believed that it was interested in him, not hostile exactly, not friendly either, just interested, the way a scientist might be interested in a specimen under a microscope. It watches me, Marsh wrote. It studies me. It is learning. I do not know what it wants, but I know that it wants something, and I know that it will not let me leave until it gets it. The later entries were fragmentary and often incoherent. Marsh wrote about conversations with the presence, long rambling dialogues that he seemed to have conducted in his dreams. He wrote about visions, images of the island as it had been thousands of years ago, before the trees, before the ice, when it was just bare rock rising from a primordial sea. He wrote about promises, things the presence had offered him in exchange for his cooperation, power, knowledge, eternal life. In return for what, Marsh never made clear. But in the final entries, there were hints. The presence needs something, Marsh wrote. Something that only a human can provide. A bridge, a doorway, a way to cross from its world into ours. And it has chosen me. In his last entry, the one I had read on my first day, Marsh seemed to have made his decision. I understand now, he wrote. I know what it wants. I know what I have to do. May God forgive me. And then he disappeared. I closed the journal and sat in the silence of the cabin, my mind racing. If Marsh was right, if there really was something in the forest, something ancient and intelligent and hungry, then I was in far more danger than I had realized. It was not just trying to scare me. It was not just playing games. It wanted something from me, and it was not going to stop until it got it. I thought about Franklin's warning. When you see it, leave. Do not investigate. Do not try to understand. Just leave. But I could not leave. The boat was gone. The radio was not working. I was trapped on an island with something that defied explanation, something that had driven one man mad and possibly killed him. I had two choices. I could stay in the cabin, barricade the doors, and wait for rescue that might never come. Or I could go into the forest. I could try to understand what I was dealing with. I could try to find a way to stop it, or at least a way to survive. Neither option was appealing, but I knew, even as I weighed them, which one I would choose. I had not come to Alaska to hide. I had come to face the things I had been running from, and if this forest wanted a confrontation, then a confrontation it would get. I left the cabin at noon on the third day. The weather had cleared somewhat. The rain had stopped, and the clouds had lifted enough to reveal patches of pale blue sky. The forest looked almost beautiful in the diffused light, the green of the trees vibrant against the gray of the rocks and the black of the still water. I brought the rifle, the flashlight, the compass, a length of rope, and a small pack with food and water. I also brought Marsh's journal, though I was not sure why. Perhaps I thought it might contain some clue I had missed. Perhaps I just wanted to have something to hold on to, some connection to another human being who had faced what I was facing. The path into the forest started at the edge of the clearing behind the cabin. It was not an official trail, just a faint track worn into the undergrowth by the passage of feet over decades. Marsh's feet probably, and the feet of others before him. I followed the path for about half a mile, pushing through ferns and ducking under low-hanging branches. The forest was dense here, the trees growing so close together that I could barely see more than a few feet in any direction. The light that filtered through the canopy was green and dim, like light at the bottom of a deep pool. I stopped frequently to check my compass and mark my trail. I did not want to get lost. I did not want to end up wandering in circles, the way Marsh had described. Every few hundred yards, I tied a strip of cloth to a tree branch, leaving a visible trail back to the cabin. After about an hour, the path began to climb. The terrain grew steeper, rockier. The trees thinned out slightly, replaced by dense thickets of devil's club and salmonberry that tore at my clothes and left scratches on my hands. I was sweating despite the cool air, my breath coming in short gasps. And then, without warning, I stepped out of the forest and into a clearing. It was not a natural clearing. The trees had been cut, recently judging by the freshness of the stumps, and arranged in a rough circle about 50 feet across. In the center of the circle was a structure. Not a cabin, not a shelter, something else. It was made of wood and bone and something that looked like dried seaweed, all woven together in an intricate pattern that hurt my eyes to look at. It was about 10 feet tall and vaguely conical, like a tipi or a hut, but the proportions were wrong. The angles did not match. The whole thing seemed to shift and shimmer in the dim light, as if it were not quite solid, not quite real. I approached slowly, the rifle raised. There was no sound except the wind in the trees and the pounding of my heart. The structure had no door, no windows, no obvious opening of any kind. It was just a solid mass of woven material, dense and impenetrable. I walked around it once, twice, looking for a way in. On my third circuit, I noticed something I had missed before. There were carvings on the wooden poles that formed the structure's frame. Figures, faces, scenes that I could not quite interpret but that filled me with a deep, instinctive dread. And at the base of one of the poles, almost hidden by the dense weave of the walls, there was a hole. Not a door, just a small opening about 2 feet across that seemed to lead into the interior of the structure. I knelt down and shone my flashlight into the hole. The beam revealed nothing but darkness, a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow the light, to drink it in and give nothing back. The air coming from the hole was cold and damp, with a faint smell that reminded me of caves, of old earth, of things long buried. Every instinct I had told me not to go inside. Every rational thought screamed that this was a trap, that whatever was in there was waiting for me, that I would never come out. But I had come this far. I had left the safety of the cabin. I had walked into the forest. I had found this place, or it had let me find it. There was no turning back now. I set down my pack and the rifle. They would be useless inside that narrow space. I kept the flashlight and the knife. Then I got down on my hands and knees and crawled into the darkness. The passage was longer than I expected. 10 feet, maybe 15, a tunnel of woven branches and bone that pressed against me on all sides. The floor was soft, covered with something that felt like fur or moss. The walls were warm, which made no sense. Warm and slightly damp, like the skin of a living thing. And then the passage opened up, and I found myself in a space that should not have existed. The interior of the structure was vast, far larger than the outside dimensions could possibly allow. I stood up and shone my flashlight around, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The beam revealed walls that curved upward and outward, disappearing into darkness above. The floor was smooth, almost polished, made of some material that I could not identify. And everywhere, on the walls, on the floor, on structures and objects that I could not name, there were carvings, faces, hundreds of faces, thousands of faces, human faces, etched into every surface, each one unique, each one frozen in an expression that was impossible to read. I walked deeper into the space, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The flashlight beam played across the faces, and I began to recognize some of them. There was a man who looked like my father, who had died when I was 12. There was a woman who looked like my ex-wife, her expression distant and sad. There was my brother, my boss, my neighbors, my friends. Everyone I had ever known, everyone I had ever loved or hated or feared. And in the center of the chamber, carved larger than all the others, there was a face I knew better than any of them. My own face. I stopped and stared at it. It was perfect. Every line, every wrinkle, every scar. It was more than a carving. It was a portrait, a record, a claim. And as I stood there, looking at my own face looking back at me, I heard a sound behind me. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. I turned, raising the flashlight, and saw something that my mind refused to process. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head nearly brushing the unseen ceiling. It was thin, its limbs too long, its joints bending in ways that defied anatomy. Its skin was gray and smooth, like wet clay, and it had no face, just a blank expanse where a face should have been. But as I watched, paralyzed with terror, features began to emerge from that blankness. A mouth, eyes, a nose, my mouth, my eyes, my nose. It was wearing my face. Samuel, it said, and its voice was my voice. Welcome home. I do not know how long I stood there, frozen, staring at the thing that wore my face. It could have been seconds. It could have been hours. Time had no meaning in that place. Time was just another lie the world told itself. The thing did not move. It just stood there, watching me with my own eyes, smiling with my own mouth, waiting. Finally, I found my voice. What are you? I asked. The thing tilted its head, my head, in a gesture that was almost human. I am what I have always been, it said. I am the forest. I am the island. I am the memory of every creature that has ever lived here, and every creature that ever will. I am the beginning and the end. I am the thing that waits. Its voice was strange, layered, as if multiple voices were speaking at once, all of them mine. It was deeply unsettling, hearing my own words come from something so alien. You have been watching me, I said, calling my name, taking my boat, trapping me here. Why? The thing smiled, my smile. It was wrong on that face, stretched too wide, held too long. Because you came to me, it said. You signed the contract. You crossed the water. You entered my domain. You are mine now, Samuel. You have always been mine. You just did not know it. I shook my head. I came here for a job, a simple job. Survey the cabin, document the wildlife, that is all. The thing laughed. My laugh, but hollow, echoing in that vast space. You came here to disappear, it said. You said so yourself. You wanted to be forgotten. You wanted to escape from everything you were. And I can give you that, Samuel. I can make you forget. I can unmake you. I can take everything you are, every memory, every regret, every fear, and absorb it into myself. You will become part of me, part of the forest, part of the island, Forever. It stepped closer, and I stepped back, my heel hitting the wall behind me. I had nowhere to go. You will not suffer, it said. There is no pain in what I offer, only peace, only silence, only the end of everything that has ever hurt you. Is that not what you wanted? Is that not why you came? I thought about my life. The marriage that had fallen apart, the business that had failed, the brother I had betrayed, all the mistakes, all the regrets, all the things I wished I could undo. The thing was right. Part of me had come to Alaska to disappear. Part of me had been hoping for exactly this, an end, a release, a way to stop running. But another part of me, the part that had survived 37 years in a world that did not owe me anything, that part was not ready to give up. No, I said. The thing stopped. What did you say? I said no, I did not come here to disappear. I came here to start over, to build something new, to find out if there was still something left of me worth saving. And I am not going to let you take that from me. The thing's expression changed. The smile faded, replaced by something colder, harder. Something that was not quite anger, but was close. You do not have a choice, it said. You are in my domain. You are surrounded by my power. You cannot fight me. You cannot escape me. You can only accept what I offer. I tightened my grip on the knife in my hand. The blade was short, barely 6 inches. It would be useless against a creature like this, but it was all I had. Then we have a problem, I said, because I am not going to accept anything, and if you want me, you are going to have to take me. The thing stared at me for a long moment, and then, slowly, it began to change. The face that had been my face melted, reformed, became something else, something older, something that I recognized from the photographs in the cabin. Ezekiel Marsh. He did not resist, the thing said in Marsh's voice. He understood. He welcomed what I offered. He became part of me willingly. And he is still here, Samuel. Still with me. Still at peace. I felt a chill run down my spine. You killed him. No. I freed him. He was trapped. Just like you. Trapped by his past, by his fears, by the weight of all the things he could not change. I gave him a way out. I gave him eternity. And I can give the same to you. It reached out a hand. Marsh's hand now, weathered and calloused, and touched my face. Its skin was cold, impossibly cold, like touching ice. Just let go, it whispered. Just surrender. It will be easier than you can imagine. And in that moment, I almost did. I felt the pull of it, the promise of oblivion, of peace, of an end to all the struggling and suffering that had defined my life. It would be so easy, so simple. Just close my eyes and let go. But then I thought about my brother, about the last conversation we had before I left for Alaska, about the look on his face when I told him I was done, that I never wanted to see him again. I had been angry. He had been hurt, and we had parted in silence, with nothing resolved, nothing forgiven. I was hired to watch empty rooms, a windowless office, flickering monitors, and 8 hours of silence every night. The library closed at midnight, but something inside it never slept. At first, the cameras showed nothing, just long halls and dark reading rooms. Then things started appearing where they shouldn't be. No alarms, no alerts, just movement. And the feeling that I was being watched. This is what happened during my overnight shift at the library. My name is Marcus Webb, and I spent 3 years working the graveyard shift at the Ashworth Public Library in Northern Ohio. When people ask me why I left, I tell them I found a better job. That is a lie. The truth is, something drove me out of that building, something I still cannot explain, something that visits me in my dreams and makes me afraid to close my eyes in dark rooms. I am writing this now because I need someone to believe me, and because I need to warn anyone who might take the job after me. The Ashworth Library is not just a building full of books. It is something else entirely, and whatever lives inside those walls is patient, intelligent, and very, very hungry. I took the security job in the fall of 2019. I had just turned 32 and was going through a difficult divorce. My ex-wife Elena had taken the house, the car, and most of my self-respect. I needed work, any work, and the overnight security position at the library seemed perfect. The pay was decent, the hours were quiet, and I would not have to deal with people asking me why I looked so tired all the time. The interview was conducted by a woman named Patricia Holloway, the head librarian. She was in her late 50s with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. She asked me the usual questions about my background and experience, but there was one question that struck me as odd. She leaned forward across her desk, her voice dropping to almost a whisper, and asked me if I was the type of person who got scared easily. I laughed and told her I had served 4 years in the Army and had done 2 tours overseas. I told her nothing scared me anymore. Patricia Holloway did not laugh. She simply nodded, made a note on her clipboard, and told me I could start the following Monday. The Ashworth Public Library was built in 1923, funded by a wealthy industrialist named Howard Ashworth, who had made his fortune in steel. The building was massive, 4 stories of red brick and Gothic architecture that looked more like a cathedral than a public library. There were gargoyles perched on the corners of the roof, their stone faces worn smooth by a century of rain and wind. The windows were tall and narrow, filled with stained glass that depicted scenes from classical literature. During the day, the library was a beautiful place, filled with natural light and the quiet murmur of patrons browsing the shelves. But at night, when the lights went out and the doors were locked, the Ashworth Library transformed into something else entirely. The shadows grew longer, the silence grew heavier, and the building seemed to breathe around you, as if it were alive and aware of your presence. My first week on the job was uneventful. I would arrive at 11:30 each night, check in with the evening staff as they prepared to leave, and then begin my rounds. The library had a security office in the basement, a small room with concrete walls and a bank of 12 monitors connected to cameras throughout the building. My job was simple. I would sit in that room, watch the monitors, and make hourly rounds through the building to ensure everything was secure. The library had an extensive collection of rare books and manuscripts, some of them worth hundreds of thousands of dollars, so security was taken seriously. I carried a flashlight, a radio, and a set of keys that could open every door in the building. I was told to call the police if I saw anything suspicious, but Patricia Holloway made it clear that false alarms were not tolerated. She told me the previous security guard had called the police 3 times in 1 month, each time convinced he had seen someone in the building. Each time, the police had found nothing. The previous guard had been let go shortly after, and Patricia Holloway told me she hoped I would not make the same mistakes. I should have asked more questions. I should have asked why the previous guard had been so convinced someone was in the building. I should have asked why Patricia Holloway's hands trembled slightly when she handed me the keys. I should have asked why the evening staff always seemed so eager to leave, practically running for the exits the moment the clock struck midnight. But I did not ask any of these questions because I needed the job and because I was arrogant enough to believe that my time in the Army had prepared me for anything. I was wrong. The first strange thing happened on my 8th night. I was sitting in the security office watching the monitors when I noticed something on camera 7. Camera 7 covered the East Reading Room on the 2nd floor, a large space filled with oak tables and antique lamps. The room was empty, as it should have been, but one of the lamps was on. I stared at the monitor for a long moment, trying to remember if that lamp had been on when I made my 11 o'clock round. I was certain it had not been. I picked up my flashlight and headed upstairs to investigate. The library was silent, except for the sound of my footsteps echoing off the marble floors. I climbed the main staircase to the 2nd floor and walked down the long hallway toward the East Reading Room. The hallway was lined with portraits of former library directors, their painted eyes seeming to follow me as I passed. I reached the reading room and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The lamp was off. I stood in the doorway, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and I felt the first prickle of unease crawl up my spine. I was certain the lamp had been on. I had seen it on the monitor, glowing warm and yellow in the darkness. But now the room was completely dark, and when I walked over to the lamp and touched the bulb, it was cold. I told myself I had imagined it. I told myself the monitor had glitched, or my eyes had played tricks on me. I went back to the security office and tried to forget about it, but over the following weeks, the strange occurrences multiplied. Books would be found on the floor in the morning, pulled from shelves that I had checked and found orderly just hours before. Doors that I had locked would be found unlocked. The elevator would move between floors on its own, the ancient machinery groaning and clanking in the silence. And then there were the sounds. Footsteps in empty hallways, whispers from darkened corners, the soft rustle of pages turning in rooms where no one should be. I began to dread my nightly rounds, my heart pounding as I walked through the shadowed stacks, my flashlight beam trembling in my grip. It was during my 3rd week that I first saw the figure on the monitors. I was doing my 2 o'clock check, scanning through each camera feed, when I noticed movement on camera 4. Camera 4 covered the main reading room on the first floor, a vast space with vaulted ceilings and rows of long wooden tables. The room was dark, except for the pale glow of the emergency exit signs, and for a moment I thought I saw something move between the tables. I leaned closer to the monitor, my breath fogging the screen. There, in the far corner of the room, I could see a shape. It was tall and thin, standing motionless in the shadows. I could not make out any details, just a dark silhouette that seemed to absorb the faint light around it. I watched for a long moment, my heart hammering in my chest, waiting for the shape to move. But it remained perfectly still, and the longer I stared at it, the more I began to doubt what I was seeing. It could have been a coat rack, I told myself. It could have been a shadow cast by one of the tall windows. I picked up my flashlight and my radio and headed upstairs to investigate. The main reading room was on the first floor, just off the main lobby. I approached the door slowly, my flashlight beam sweeping back and forth across the marble floor. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty. I walked through the rows of tables, checking every corner, every shadow. There was no coat rack, no piece of furniture that could have created the silhouette I had seen on the monitor. I stood in the far corner where the figure had been standing and looked around. There was nothing there but empty air and the faint smell of old books. I told myself I had imagined it, but even as I walked back to the security office, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following night, I saw the figure again. It was on camera 9 this time, standing at the end of a long corridor on the 3rd floor. The corridor was lined with tall bookshelves, their upper reaches disappearing into darkness beyond the reach of the emergency lights. The figure stood at the far end, perfectly still, facing the camera. I could not see its face, could not make out any features at all. It was just a shape, a darkness in the shape of a person. I watched it for nearly 10 minutes, waiting for it to move, waiting for some indication that it was real. It never moved. Finally, I gathered my courage and went upstairs to investigate. When I reached the 3rd floor corridor, the figure was gone. There was nothing there but empty shelves and the musty smell of old paper. This became a pattern over the following weeks. Every night, I would see the figure on one of the monitors. It was never in the same place twice. Sometimes it was standing in a doorway. Sometimes it was sitting at a table in one of the reading rooms. Sometimes it was standing at the far end of a long hallway, barely visible in the dim light. But no matter where it appeared, it was always watching, always facing the camera. And every time I went to investigate, it was gone by the time I arrived. I began to wonder if I was losing my mind. The stress of the divorce, the isolation of the night shift, the oppressive silence of the empty library. Maybe it was all getting to me. I considered quitting, but I needed the money, and I was too proud to admit that an empty building had gotten the better of me. It was in early November when things took a darker turn. I was making my 3 o'clock round, walking through the basement archives, when I heard something that made my blood run cold. It was a voice, soft and distant, echoing through the concrete corridors. I stopped walking and held my breath, straining to hear. The voice was whispering, but I could not make out the words. It seemed to be coming from somewhere ahead of me, from the rare books vault at the end of the corridor. I gripped my flashlight tighter and continued forward, my footsteps impossibly loud in the silence. The corridor ended at a heavy steel door with a keypad lock. The rare books vault contained the library's most valuable items, including a collection of medieval manuscripts and a first edition of Paradise Lost. I punched in the code and pulled the door open. The vault was small, maybe 15 feet square, with climate-controlled cabinets lining the walls. My flashlight beam swept across the room, illuminating the glass cases and their precious contents. The room was empty. There was no one there. But as I turned to leave, I heard the voice again, clearer this time, and I realized with a shock of terror that it was coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slashing through the darkness. There was nothing there. The vault was empty, the corridor behind me was empty, and yet I could still hear the whispering, soft and insistent, like someone speaking just behind my ear. I ran. I am not ashamed to admit it. I ran back through the basement, up the stairs, and did not stop until I was back in the security office with the door locked behind me. I sat there for the rest of the night, watching the monitors, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my coffee cup. I did not make any more rounds that night. The next morning, I almost told Patricia Holloway what had happened. I almost told her about the figure on the monitors, the whispers in the basement, the overwhelming sense that something was wrong with the building. But when I walked into her office, she looked at me with those cold, knowing eyes, and I lost my nerve. Instead, I asked her a question that had been bothering me for weeks. I asked her what had happened to the previous security guards. Patricia Holloway was silent for a long moment. Then she told me that the position had a high turnover rate. She told me that most guards lasted only a few months before finding other employment. When I pressed her for details, she became evasive. She told me that some people were simply not suited for overnight work, that the isolation and the silence could play tricks on the mind. She told me that if I was having difficulties, I was welcome to resign at any time. There was something in her voice, something that sounded almost like a warning. I thanked her for her time and left her office without another word. I should have quit that day. I know that now. But I was stubborn, and I was broke, and I convinced myself that there had to be a rational explanation for everything I had experienced. Old buildings made strange noises. Security cameras had glitches. The human mind, especially under stress, could see things that were not there. I told myself these things over and over again until I almost believed them. And so I kept coming back, night after night, to sit in that basement office and watch the monitors and pretend that everything was normal. It was 3 weeks later, on the night before Thanksgiving, that everything changed. The library was closed for the holiday, which meant I was alone in the building for the entire night. No evening staff to check in with, no one to call if something went wrong. Just me and the monitors and the endless, oppressive silence. I arrived at 11:30 as usual and began my first round. The building felt different that night, though I could not say exactly how. The air seemed heavier, the shadows seemed darker, and there was a tension in the atmosphere that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I completed my round quickly and retreated to the security office, telling myself I was being paranoid. At 1:15 in the morning, I saw the figure again. It was on camera too, standing in the main lobby near the circulation desk. But this time, something was different. This time, the figure was not standing still. It was moving, walking slowly across the lobby toward the main staircase. I watched, transfixed, as it climbed the stairs and disappeared from the frame. I quickly switched to camera 5, which covered the second-floor landing. The figure appeared a moment later, walking with that same slow, deliberate pace, heading toward the east wing. I switched to camera 7. The figure walked into the east reading room and stopped in the center of the space, directly beneath the antique chandelier. And then, for the first time, it turned to face the camera directly. I still cannot describe what I saw. The figure had no face, or rather, its face was a void. A darkness so complete that it seemed to pull the light from the air around it. I felt a cold wave of terror wash over me, so intense that I could not breathe, could not move, could not look away from that faceless darkness staring at me through the monitor. And then the figure raised one hand and pointed directly at the camera, directly at me. The monitors went black. All 12 screens flickered once and then went dark, plunging the security office into complete darkness. I sat there in the blackness, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, listening to the sudden, total silence. The hum of the computers was gone. The soft whir of the air conditioning was gone. Even the distant tick of the old clock in the lobby was gone. There was nothing, only darkness and silence and the overwhelming certainty that I was no longer alone. I fumbled for my flashlight and switched it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the concrete walls of the security office, the dead monitors, the door that led out into the basement corridor. I knew I should stay in the office. I knew I should wait for the power to come back on. But something was pulling at me, a compulsion I could not explain, drawing me out of the relative safety of that small room and into the darkness of the library. I stood up on shaking legs, crossed to the door, and stepped out into the corridor. The basement was pitch black except for the pale beam of my flashlight. I walked slowly, my footsteps echoing off the concrete walls, my breathing loud and ragged in my ears. I passed the rare books vault, past the storage rooms filled with old furniture and forgotten donations, and climbed the stairs to the first floor. The lobby was dark, the only light coming from my flashlight and the faint glow of the exit signs running on battery backup. I swept my beam across the room, across the circulation desk, and the rows of public computers and the tall windows that looked out onto the empty street. The lobby was empty. I crossed to the main staircase and began to climb. I do not know why I went to the east reading room. I do not know why I felt compelled to go to the exact spot where I had seen the figure on the monitor. It was as if something was guiding me, pulling me forward against my will. I climbed to the second floor and walked down the long corridor toward the east wing. The portraits on the walls seemed different in the darkness, their painted faces twisted into expressions of fear and warning. I reached the reading room and pushed open the door. The room was not empty. There were people sitting at the tables, dozens of them, sitting motionless in the darkness. My flashlight beam swept across their faces, and I saw that they were not people at all, not anymore. They were hollow, empty, their eyes dark pits and their mouths hanging open in silent screams. They were dressed in clothing from different eras, some in modern dress and some in fashions from decades past. A woman in a flapper dress sat next to a man in a three-piece suit. A teenage boy in a varsity jacket sat across from an elderly woman in a housecoat. They were all perfectly still, like mannequins, like statues, and yet I could feel them watching me, could feel their empty eyes tracking my movements as I stood frozen in the doorway. And then one of them moved. The woman in the flapper dress turned her head slowly, her neck making a dry, crackling sound, and she looked directly at me. Her mouth opened wider, impossibly wide, and a sound came out that I cannot describe. It was like a whisper and a scream at the same time, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a sound that filled my head and made my vision blur and my thoughts scatter like leaves in the wind. I dropped my flashlight and ran. I ran through the corridor and down the stairs and across the lobby, and I did not stop until I burst through the emergency exit and out into the cold November night. I sat on the steps of the library, shaking and gasping for air, watching the dark windows for any sign of movement. There was nothing. The library was silent and still, just a building, just brick and mortar and glass. I sat there until the sun came up, and then I went home and did not leave my apartment for 3 days. I quit the job, of course. I called Patricia Holloway and told her I would not be coming back. She did not seem surprised. She simply thanked me for my service and told me my final paycheck would be mailed. There was no curiosity in her voice, no concern. It was as if she had been expecting this, as if she knew exactly what I had seen and was simply waiting for me to break. In the months that followed, I tried to forget what had happened. I moved to a new city, found a new job, tried to build a new life, but I could not stop thinking about the Ashworth Library, about the figure on the monitors, about those hollow people sitting in the darkness of the East Reading Room. I began to research the library's history, spending my nights scouring old newspaper archives and historical records, trying to find some explanation for what I had experienced. What I found was worse than anything I could have imagined. The Ashworth Public Library was built on the site of an old poorhouse that had burned down in 1891. The fire had killed 47 people, mostly indigent and mentally ill patients who had been locked in their rooms for the night. The bodies were so badly burned that most could not be identified, and they were buried in a mass grave on the grounds. When Howard Ashworth purchased the land in 1922, he had the grave dug up and the remains moved to a potter's field on the outskirts of town. Local historians noted that many of the bones had been damaged during the excavation, scattered and mixed together until it was impossible to tell which remains belonged to which victim. But that was not the worst of it. The worst came when I began to research the history of the library itself, the decades of strange occurrences and unexplained events that had been carefully documented and then quietly buried. I found newspaper clippings about library patrons who had disappeared without a trace, about staff members who had suffered mental breakdowns, about security guards who had quit in the middle of their shifts and refused to explain why. I found a police report from 1958 about a graduate student named Arthur Chen who had been found dead in the rare books vault, his face frozen in an expression of absolute terror, his hair turned completely white. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as heart failure, but there was a note in the margins, scribbled in pencil by one of the investigating officers. The note said 3 words: he saw something. I found records of a renovation project in 1974 that had to be abandoned when 3 construction workers reported seeing a figure standing in the basement, a figure that vanished when they approached. I found an interview with a former head librarian named Margaret Ellis, who had resigned in 1989 after claiming that the building was haunted by the ghosts of the poorhouse victims. She had told reporters that the spirits were angry, that they had been disturbed when their graves were desecrated, and that they would never rest until they were properly mourned. Margaret Ellis died in a psychiatric hospital in 1993. Her death was ruled a suicide. The more I researched, the more I found, and the more I found, the more certain I became that something terrible was living in the Ashworth Library. Not ghosts, not exactly. Something older and hungrier, something that fed on fear and isolation and the dark hours of the night. The poorhouse fire had opened a door, and Howard Ashworth had built his library right on top of it. The thing that lived there now was not the spirits of the dead. It was something else, something that wore their faces and used their forms to lure the living into its trap. I tried to warn people. I wrote letters to the library board, to the mayor's office, to the local newspapers. No one listened. No one believed me. I was just another disturbed former employee, another casualty of the night shift. Patricia Holloway sent me a cease and desist letter threatening legal action if I continued to spread what she called malicious falsehoods about the library. I stopped writing letters after that, but I never stopped watching, never stopped paying attention. In the years since I left, 3 more security guards have quit the Ashworth Library. 2 of them moved out of state. 1 of them disappeared entirely. His apartment found empty. His belongings untouched, his car still parked in his usual spot. The police investigated but found nothing. He is still listed as a missing person. I know what happened to him. I know because it almost happened to me. The thing in the library took him, just like it took Arthur Chen, just like it took all those people sitting in the East reading room. They are still there, all of them sitting in the darkness, waiting for the next person to walk through those doors and never come out. I am telling this story now because I have received news that the Ashworth Library is hiring again. They are looking for a night security guard, someone to watch the monitors and walk the empty halls between midnight and dawn. The salary is good, the benefits are decent, and the job description makes it sound almost peaceful. A quiet position for someone who enjoys solitude, it says. No experience necessary. If you are thinking about applying, I am begging you, do not. Find another job, any other job. Work at a gas station, work at a fast food restaurant, work at a warehouse loading trucks in the middle of the night. Anything is better than what waits for you in the Ashworth Library. Because once it sees you, once it knows you are there, it will never stop watching. And one night, when the monitors go dark and the silence closes in around you, it will come for you. And you will join those hollow people in the East reading room, sitting in the darkness forever, waiting for the next victim to walk through the door. I still have nightmares about that night. I still wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear whispers coming from the darkness outside my window. I still cannot bring myself to enter a library after dark, cannot walk past the Ashworth building without feeling my heart begin to race. The thing in the library marked me somehow, and part of me knows that it is still waiting, still watching, still hungry. This is my warning, my confession, my plea for someone to believe me. The Ashworth Public Library is not what it seems. There is something living in those walls, something ancient and malevolent and patient beyond human understanding. It has been feeding on people for over a century, and it will continue to feed for centuries more unless someone finds a way to stop it. But I do not think anyone can stop it. I think it is too old, too powerful, too deeply rooted in that building and that land. All we can do is stay away, keep our distance, and pray that it never decides to expand its hunting grounds beyond those red brick walls. My name is Marcus Webb, and I was hired to watch empty rooms. What I found there was far worse than anything I could have imagined. Some doors should never be opened. Some buildings should never be entered after dark. And some jobs are not worth any amount of money in the world. If you ever find yourself in northern Ohio, drive past the Ashworth Library. Look at those Gothic spires and those stained glass windows and those gargoyles perched on the roof. Admire the architecture from a safe distance. But whatever you do not go inside, especially not at night, especially not alone, because something is waiting in there, something that never sleeps, something that watches through every camera and listens through every wall. And if it decides it wants you, there is nowhere you can hide and nothing you can do. Trust me. I know. I learned the hard way that some places are better left alone. The Ashworth Library taught me that lesson, and I will carry the scars of that knowledge for the rest of my life. I only hope that by sharing my story, I can save someone else from making the same mistake. Stay safe. Stay away from empty buildings and dark hallways and jobs that seem too good to be true. And if you ever hear whispers in the silence or see shadows moving where nothing should move, run. Do not investigate. Do not try to be brave. Just run and do not look back. Because some things, once seen, can never be unseen, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed. This is Marcus Webb, signing off. I hope you never have to learn the truth about the Ashworth Library. I hope my story is just another creepy tale on the internet. Something to entertain you for a few minutes before you move on with your day. But if you find yourself standing outside those red brick walls, staring up at those dark windows, remember what I told you. Remember the empty rooms. Remember the flickering monitors. Remember the figure with no face, and walk away while you still can. The library closes at midnight, but something inside never sleeps. and it is always, always watching. I thought my story was over when I left Ohio. I thought that by putting distance between myself and the Ashworth Library, I could escape whatever had taken root in my mind during those dark months. I was wrong. The thing that lived in that building did not need physical proximity to reach me. It had marked me during my time there, left some invisible stain on my soul, and no matter how far I ran, I could never truly get away. The nightmare started a month after I left. At first they were vague, formless things, just a sense of dread that followed me into sleep and lingered after I woke. But as the weeks passed, they became more specific, more detailed, more terrifying. I would find myself back in the library, walking those empty halls, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I would see the figure standing at the end of a corridor or sitting at a table in one of the reading rooms. And always, always, it would turn to face me. That void where its face should be pulling at my sanity like a black hole pulling at light. In some dreams, I would be back in the East reading room, surrounded by those hollow people with their empty eyes and silent screams. They would rise from their chairs, moving toward me with slow, shuffling steps, reaching out with gray, withered hands. I would try to run, but my legs would not move, would not obey the desperate commands of my brain. I would stand there, frozen, as they closed in around me, their cold fingers brushing against my skin, their whispered voices filling my head with words I could not understand. I woke from these dreams drenched in sweat, my heart racing, my throat raw from screaming. I tried sleeping pills, tried meditation, tried therapy. Nothing helped. The dreams came every night, relentless and inescapable, wearing me down until I could barely function during the day. I lost my new job. I lost my new apartment. I spent my days in a fog of exhaustion and fear, my nights in a prison of nightmare and memory. It was during this period that I began to see things while I was awake. Small things at first, a shadow that moved when nothing was there to cast it, a flicker of movement at the edge of my vision that vanished when I turned to look, the feeling of being watched, even in brightly lit rooms, even in the middle of crowded streets. I told myself it was the lack of sleep, the stress, the lingering trauma. But deep down, I knew the truth. The thing from the library had followed me. It was not finished with me yet. The first time I saw the figure outside the library was on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. I was sitting in a coffee shop near my new apartment, staring blankly at a laptop screen, when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I looked up and saw it standing on the sidewalk outside the window. It was just a dark shape, a silhouette against the bright afternoon sun, but I recognized it immediately. The tall, thin form. The absence of features, the absolute stillness that no living thing could maintain. I stared at it for a long moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. And then a bus passed by, blocking my view for just a second, and when it was gone, so was the figure. I left the coffee shop and ran back to my apartment, my heart pounding, my mind reeling. I locked the door behind me and checked every window, every closet, every corner of every room. I was alone. Of course I was alone. The figure had not followed me, could not follow me. It was just a hallucination, a trick of my exhausted mind. I repeated these words to myself like a mantra, but I could not make myself believe them. The sightings continued over the following weeks. I would see the figure in crowds, standing motionless while people flowed around it like water around a stone. I would see it in windows, reflected behind me when I looked in mirrors and shop fronts. I would see it standing at the foot of my bed when I woke in the middle of the night, its void face turned toward me, its presence filling the room with a cold so intense I could see my breath misting in the air. And always, when I blinked or looked away, or turned on a light, it would be gone, leaving nothing but the memory of terror and the lingering certainty that it was only a matter of time before it came for me. I considered going back to Ohio. I considered confronting whatever was in the Ashworth Library, demanding answers, demanding release from this torment. But I knew that was exactly what it wanted. The thing in the library was patient. It had been waiting for over a century, feeding on fear and darkness and the slow erosion of human sanity. It could wait a little longer. And when I finally broke, when I finally surrendered and walked back through those doors, it would be ready for me. So I fought. I fought with every ounce of strength I had left, every shred of willpower that had not been worn away by sleepless nights and waking nightmares. I started researching ways to protect myself, delving into the obscure corners of folklore and the occult that I had always dismissed as superstition. I learned about salt lines and iron wards, about protective symbols and cleansing rituals. I covered my apartment in sigils I did not understand, burned sage until my neighbors complained about the smoke, slept with an iron blade under my pillow. I do not know if any of it helped. I do not know if there was anything that could help against a force as old and powerful as the thing in the library. But doing something, anything, made me feel less helpless, less like a lamb waiting for the slaughter. The turning point came 6 months after I left Ohio. I received a letter in the mail, hand-addressed in old-fashioned script with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper covered in dense, cramped handwriting. The letter was from Margaret Ellis. Margaret Ellis had been the head librarian who resigned in 1989, the one who had claimed the library was haunted, the one who had died in a psychiatric hospital. But the letter was dated just 3 days earlier. The writing was lucid and coherent, describing in precise detail everything I had experienced during my time at the Ashworth Library. The figure on the monitors, the whispers in the basement, the hollow people in the East Reading Room. It was as if Margaret Ellis had been watching me, recording my every move, waiting for the right moment to make contact. The letter ended with an invitation. Margaret Ellis wrote that she had found a way to stop the thing in the library, a way to close the door that had been opened over a century ago. She wrote that she needed my help to complete the ritual. She wrote that if I did not come, if I did not face my fear and return to the source of my torment, the thing would never stop hunting me. It would follow me for the rest of my life, growing stronger, drawing closer, until finally it consumed me entirely. There was an address at the bottom of the letter, a location in the countryside outside of the town where the Ashworth Library stood. A meeting place, a final chance. I knew it was probably a trap. I knew that Margaret Ellis had died in 1993, that the letter could not possibly be from her. But I also knew that I could not keep living like this, could not spend the rest of my life running from shadows and seeing monsters in every dark corner. If there was even the slightest chance that the letter was genuine, that there was a way to end this nightmare, I had to take it. I bought a bus ticket back to Ohio. I packed a bag with everything I thought I might need: salt, iron, matches, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a copy of every protective symbol I had found in my research. I did not know what I would find when I reached the address on the letter. I did not know if I would survive the night. But I was done running. I was done being afraid. Whatever was waiting for me in Ohio, I was going to face it head on, and I was going to either destroy it or die trying. The bus ride was long and uneventful. I spent most of it staring out the window at the passing countryside, watching the sunset and the darkness creep in from the edges of the sky. I arrived in town just after midnight, which seemed appropriate given the circumstances. The streets were empty, the shops were closed, and the only light came from the street lamps casting pale pools of illumination on the cracked sidewalks. I rented a car from the only agency that was still open, a 24-hour place near the bus station staffed by a bored teenager who barely looked up from his phone as he handed me the keys. I punched the address from the letter into the GPS and started driving. The route took me out of town and into the countryside, past farms and fields and stretches of forest that seemed to swallow the headlights whole. The further I drove, the darker it got, until finally the GPS announced that I had arrived at my destination. I was parked in front of an old farmhouse, the kind of place that had probably been beautiful once, but had been abandoned and left to rot decades ago. The windows were broken, the roof was sagging, and the porch was covered in fallen leaves and debris. There was no light inside, no sign that anyone had been here in years. But parked in the driveway, covered in a layer of dust but still recognizable, was an old station wagon with Ohio plates. I got out of the car and approached the farmhouse, my flashlight in one hand and the iron blade in the other. The porch steps creaked under my weight as I climbed them, and the front door swung open at my touch, its hinges shrieking in the silence. Inside, the house was a maze of shadowed rooms and collapsed furniture, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. I moved through the darkness, my flashlight beam sweeping from side to side, my heart pounding in my chest. I found her in the basement. Margaret Ellis was sitting in a chair in the center of the room, surrounded by candles that had long since burned down to stubs. She was old, impossibly old, her face a map of wrinkles and her hair a thin white cloud around her skull. But her eyes were sharp and bright, fixed on me with an intensity that made me want to look away. She smiled when she saw me, a smile that held no warmth or humor. "Welcome, Marcus," she said. "I have been waiting for you." I asked her how she was alive, how she had survived all these years, how she had found me. She laughed at my questions, a dry, brittle sound like dead leaves rustling in the wind. She told me that death was not an escape from the thing in the library. She told me that she had died in that psychiatric hospital, just as the record said, but that dying had not freed her. The thing had claimed her spirit, bound it to the building, used her as a lure to draw others into its web. She was not truly alive, she said. She was something else now, something in between, existing in the spaces between life and death, memory and oblivion. But she had retained some small part of herself, some spark of the woman she had been. And over the long years of her imprisonment, she had learned things. She had learned the nature of the thing in the library, had discovered its origins and its weaknesses. She had found a way to destroy it, to close the door that had been opened when the poorhouse burned. But she could not do it alone. She needed someone from outside, someone who was still alive, still connected to the world of the living. She needed me. I asked her why I should trust her. I asked her how I knew this was not a trap, not some elaborate scheme to deliver me to the thing that had been hunting me. She told me I had no reason to trust her, no reason at all. But she also told me that I had no other options. The thing would never stop. It would follow me until I died, and then it would claim my spirit just as it had claimed hers. The only way to be free, the only way for either of us to find peace, was to destroy it once and for all. I looked at her sitting there in the candlelight, this ancient woman who had been dead for decades, and I made my decision. I told her I would help. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, I would do what needed to be done. Margaret Ellis nodded slowly, her bright eyes gleaming in the darkness. "Good," she said. "Then we begin tonight." She told me the ritual would have to be performed in the library itself, in the very heart of the thing's power. She told me we would need to enter the building at the darkest hour of the night, the hour between 3 and 4 when the veil between worlds was thinnest. She told me there would be dangers, horrors beyond anything I had experienced. But if we were strong, if we did not falter, we could end this. We could destroy the thing and free its victims. We could close the door forever. We drove back to town together in my rented car. Margaret Ellis, sitting in the passenger seat like a corpse propped up for a funeral viewing. She did not speak during the drive, did not move except to occasionally turn her head and stare at me with those unnervingly bright eyes. I focused on the road and tried not to think about what we were about to do. The Ashworth Library loomed before us as we approached, its Gothic spires and stained glass windows dark against the night sky. The building looked different somehow, more menacing, as if it knew we were coming and was preparing itself for battle. I parked the car in the empty lot and turned off the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. Margaret Ellis reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew a key, old and tarnished and ornate. "The master key," she said. "It opens every door in the building, including the one that matters most." I took the key and examined it in the dim light from the street lamps. It was cold to the touch, colder than it should have been, and I could feel something humming inside it, a vibration that seemed to resonate with the building before us. We entered through a side door, a service entrance that led into the basement. The library was even darker than I remembered, the emergency lights that should have been glowing softly along the corridors completely extinguished. Margaret Ellis walked beside me, her footsteps silent on the concrete floor, her presence a cold spot in the warm summer air. I followed her deeper into the building, past the security office where I had spent so many terrifying nights, past the rare books vault where I had heard the whispers, down a corridor I had never noticed before to a door I had never seen. The door was small and unassuming, just another patch of wall, unless you knew exactly where to look. Margaret Ellis pointed at the door and told me to use the key. I slid the old tarnished key into the lock and turned it. There was a click, loud in the silence, and the door swung open. Beyond the door was a staircase, spiraling down into a darkness so complete that my flashlight beam seemed to be swallowed whole. The air that rose from below was cold and damp and smelled of earth and decay. "This was it," Margaret Ellis said. "The heart of the building, the place where the door was opened, the thing's true home." We descended. The staircase seemed to go on forever, spiraling down and down and down until I lost all sense of time and direction. The walls were stone, rough and ancient, covered in symbols that I recognized from my research. Protective wards, binding sigils, attempts by previous victims to contain what they had unleashed. None of them had worked. The thing was still here, still hungry, still waiting. At the bottom of the stairs was a chamber. It was large and circular, the walls lined with alcoves that held ancient books and scrolls and artifacts I could not identify. In the center of the room was a circle inscribed on the floor, filled with more symbols and surrounded by candles that burned with a pale, ghostly light. And standing in the center of the circle, waiting for us with that void where its face should be, was the figure. I froze when I saw it, every muscle in my body locking up, every thought in my mind dissolving into blind, paralyzing terror. The figure stood motionless, its darkness absolute, its presence filling the chamber with a cold so intense I could feel it in my bones. This was it, I realized. This was the thing that had haunted my dreams, that had followed me across states, that had been waiting for me to return since the moment I first set foot in this building. Margaret Ellis stepped forward, her voice rising in a chant I could not understand. The words were old, older than English, older than Latin, older than any language I had ever heard. They seemed to twist the air around her, to create patterns of light and shadow that danced across the walls. The figure reacted, its void face turning toward her, its presence focusing on her with an intensity that made my ears ring and my vision blur. She told me to complete the ritual. She told me to light the candles in the proper order, to speak the words she had taught me during the drive, to focus my will on the thing in the center of the circle. She told me not to look away, not to flinch, not to let my fear overcome me. She told me this was our only chance. I do not know how I found the strength to move. I do not know how I forced my trembling hands to light the candles, forced my dry throat to speak the ancient words, forced my mind to focus on the thing before me when every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. But I did it. I completed the ritual, just as Margaret Ellis had instructed, and I watched as the thing in the center of the circle began to change. It shrieked, a sound that was not a sound, a vibration that I felt in every cell of my body. The void where its face should be began to crack, to fracture, to splinter with lines of blinding white light. The darkness that had cloaked it began to peel away, revealing something beneath that I cannot describe. Something so alien and terrible that my mind simply refused to process what my eyes were seeing. I looked away, finally, unable to bear it any longer, and I saw Margaret Ellis standing at the edge of the circle, her body dissolving into light, her face transfixed with an expression of peace. And then it was over. The thing was gone. The chamber was empty. The candles had burned out, leaving only wisps of smoke curling toward the ceiling. Margaret Ellis was nowhere to be seen, but somehow I knew she was finally free, finally at rest after all those years of imprisonment. The door had been closed. The nightmare had ended. I climbed back up the spiral staircase, back through the basement, back out into the warm summer night. The library looked different now, smaller somehow, less menacing. It was just a building, just brick and mortar and glass. Whatever had lived inside those walls was gone, and it would never come back. I drove out of town that night, and I have never been back. I do not know what happened to the Ashworth Library after I left. I do not know if the staff noticed that something had changed, that the shadows were lighter and the silence was less oppressive. I do not know if the hollow people in the East Reading Room were finally released, if their spirits were able to move on to whatever awaits us after death. What I do know is that the nightmares stopped. The sightings stopped. The feeling of being watched, that constant, gnawing terror that had been my companion for so many months, faded and eventually disappeared entirely. I was free. Against all odds, against everything I had believed was possible, I had faced the darkness and survived. I still think about those days sometimes, those long nights in the security office watching the monitors, those moments of pure terror when I saw things that should not exist. I think about Margaret Ellis and the sacrifice she made, about all the victims who were trapped in that building for so long. I hope they found peace. I hope the door stays closed forever. And I hope, whoever you are reading this, that you never have to face what I faced. I hope you live a long and happy life, free from the knowledge that there are things in this world beyond our understanding, things that lurk in the dark corners and wait for the unwary. I hope my story is just a story to you, a creepy tale to read on a quiet night, something to give you a pleasant shiver before you move on with your day. But if you ever find yourself in an old building late at night, if you ever feel that prickle on the back of your neck that tells you something is watching, remember what I told you. Remember that some doors should never be opened.